My wife watched her lover push me down a flight of stairs and shatter my leg. Then she leaned over my broken body and whispered that no one would ever believe me. From a cold hospital bed, I made the one phone call I swore I would never make. I called my estranged father. And weeks later, in a packed courtroom, my father stood up and incinerated the multi-million-dollar firm he spent his entire life building just to watch them burn. But to understand how a father destroys his own empire, you have to understand the day my life was torn apart. The sound of a bone snapping is not something you forget. It sounds like a thick oak branch breaking under the weight of a heavy winter snow. That was the sound my right leg made when it hit the hardwood floor at the bottom of my own staircase. I lay there on the polished oak, gasping for air. The pain was a blinding white-hot flash that started in my shin and shot straight up into my chest. I could not breathe. I could not scream. I could only stare at the ceiling and try to process the reality of what had just happened. I am 36 years old. I teach 8th grade history at a public middle school. I live a quiet life. Or at least I thought I did. 10 minutes earlier, I had pulled into my driveway in my beat-up sedan. The school board meeting had ended 2 hours early. I was exhausted. My hands were covered in dry erase marker dust and my cheap suit felt heavy. All I wanted was to walk into my house, kiss my wife Chloe, and sit on the couch. But when I unlocked the front door, I heard voices coming from the upstairs master bedroom, not the television. Real voices. I walked up the carpeted stairs, calling out Chloe's name. The bedroom door was half open, and there they were. My wife was buttoning up her silk blouse. Standing next to her, tightening the belt of his custom-tailored trousers, was Julian. Julian is 36 years old, just like me. But that is where the similarities end. Julian is the managing partner of my father's wealth management firm. He is the man who handles accounts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He is the man who wears $5,000 suits and drives a car that costs more than my house. He is also the man my father always wished was his real son. When I saw them, my mind went blank. I dropped my leather briefcase. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. Julian did not jump. He did not look ashamed. He simply finished buckling his belt and let out a long sigh of annoyance. He looked at me not with fear, but with total disgust, like I was a stray dog that had wandered into a 5-star restaurant. I demanded to know what was going on. My voice shook. I stepped toward him. But before I could even process the betrayal, Julian closed the distance between us. He grabbed me by the collar of my cheap dress shirt. He is an avid rower, strong and imposing. He dragged me out into the hallway and shoved me backward with all his strength. I lost my footing. I tumbled backward down 14 wooden steps, and now here I was, lying at the bottom of the stairs with a shattered tibia. My leg was bent at an unnatural angle. The pain was so intense my vision blurred. I reached out a trembling hand toward the entryway table where I had left my cell phone. I needed to call an ambulance. I needed help. Then I heard the slow, confident clicking of high heels descending the staircase. Chloe walked down the steps. She did not rush. She did not look horrified. She calmly descended the stairs, stepping right over my body. She walked to the hallway mirror and began fixing her hair. She adjusted her designer necklace, the one she told me she bought with her commission from a recent real estate deal. Now I knew exactly who had really bought it. I groaned, clutching my knee. "Chloe," I gasped. "Please, my leg is broken. Call an ambulance." She turned around and looked down at me. There was no warmth in her eyes. The woman I had married, the woman I had sworn to love and protect, looked at me with an expression of absolute contempt. She knelt down beside me. I thought for a second she was going to comfort me. Instead, she leaned in close, so close I could smell her expensive perfume. "Do not bother calling the cops, Harrison," she whispered. Her voice was ice cold. "Look at you. You are a middle school teacher who can barely afford the homeowners association fees on this house. Julian manages portfolios larger than the gross domestic product of small countries. Who do you think they will believe?" Her words hurt more than the shattered bone in my leg. They cut through the physical agony and hit me right in the soul, because I knew she was right. In the eyes of the world, in the eyes of the corporate society we lived in, I was nothing. I had grown up surrounded by wealth. My father Richard built a financial empire from nothing. He spent 40 years turning a small accounting practice into a massive wealth management firm in the heart of the city. He lived for power. He lived for control. And from the moment I was old enough to speak, he tried to mold me into a ruthless corporate shark just like him. But I never wanted that life. I never cared about stock portfolios or offshore tax shelters. I loved history. I loved teaching. I wanted to help kids understand the world. When I told my father I was getting a degree in education, he stopped talking to me for 6 months. When I graduated and took a job paying $40,000 a year, he looked at me and said I had thrown my life in the garbage. Julian was the man my father hired to take the spot I had refused. Julian was everything my father wanted in a son. He was aggressive. He was hungry for money. He knew how to bend the rules just far enough to make a massive profit without crossing a legal line. Over the years, Julian became my father's right-hand man. He was invited to family dinners where my father would praise Julian's financial brilliance while completely ignoring my presence. And Chloe had changed. When we first met, she was a struggling real estate agent. She told me she loved how grounded I was. She told me she loved my heart. But as the years went by, the city changed her. She started selling high-end luxury properties to wealthy clients. She started attending galas and charity dinners. She started looking at my teacher's salary not as a respectable living, but as an embarrassing failure. She wanted the lifestyle that Julian had, and apparently she decided to just take it. I tried to push myself up on my elbows, but a sharp wave of nausea washed over me. Julian walked down the stairs. He adjusted his cuffs and looked down at me with a smirk. "You really should have texted before coming home, Harrison," Julian said casually. He stepped over my broken leg, making sure his expensive leather shoes did not touch my blood. "You always were terrible at reading the room." "You are going to prison for this," I choked out. I could taste copper in my mouth. "I will tell the police exactly what you did. You broke into my house and you assaulted me." Julian laughed, a genuine loud laugh that echoed off the high ceiling of the foyer. "Your house," he mocked. "Please, Harrison, you and I both know Chloe pays the mortgage here. You are just a guest, a very unwelcome guest." Chloe stood up and crossed her arms. "We need to handle this, Julian," she said. Her voice was remarkably steady. "We cannot have him telling people you pushed him. It will ruin the country club dinner this weekend. Do not worry about a thing," Julian said. He pulled a sleek silver smartphone from his pocket. "I have dealt with much bigger problems than a whining public school teacher." I watched in horror as Julian did something I will never forget. He walked over to the hallway wall and violently punched it, putting a hole right through the drywall. He then grabbed a heavy glass vase from the console table and smashed it on the ground near my feet. He ruffled his own hair and tore the top button off his expensive shirt. "What are you doing?" I asked. The pain in my leg was making me dizzy, but I recognized the staging of a crime scene. Julian ignored me. He unlocked his phone and dialed 911. He held the phone to his ear, and his entire demeanor changed in a fraction of a second. The arrogant smirk vanished. His eyes widened. He began breathing heavily, simulating pure panic. "Hello, yes, please send the police," Julian shouted into the phone. His voice trembled flawlessly. "I am at my colleague's house. Her husband just came home completely drunk. He is violently out of control. He tried to attack us. He fell down the stairs and he is threatening to kill us. Please hurry. He is completely unhinged." He gave the operator my address and hung up. He looked back down at me. The fake panic instantly dissolved back into a cold, calculated smile. "You see, Harrison," Julian said, crouching down to my eye level. "In the real world, truth does not matter. The only thing that matters is who has the power to control the narrative. I am a respected financial executive. Chloe is a prominent real estate broker. You are a low-level teacher with a history of family estrangement. The police are going to walk through that door. and they are going to see a jealous, erratic failure who tried to attack his successful wife and her friend. "You are insane," I whispered. The edges of my vision were starting to go dark. The pain was radiating up my spine. My lungs felt incredibly heavy. "I am effective," Julian corrected. He stood up and brushed invisible dust off his trousers. "And by tomorrow morning you are going to be sitting in a jail cell facing felony assault charges. Chloe will file for an emergency restraining order. She will get exclusive possession of this house, and you will be left with absolutely nothing." Chloe did not even look remorseful. She looked relieved. Julian had just solved her problem. She walked over to Julian and wrapped her arm around his. "Just stay down, Harrison," Chloe said. Her voice lacked any trace of the woman I had spent the last 5 years of my life with. "Do not make this harder than it has to be. If you just plead guilty and stay quiet, maybe the judge will go easy on you." I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and fight, but my body was completely broken. I lay there on the cold hardwood floor, trapped in my own home. I was a prisoner in the life I had worked so hard to build. The unfairness of it all was suffocating. I had played by the rules. I had chosen an honest profession. I had been a faithful husband. And my reward was a shattered leg and a wife who looked at me like I was garbage. The distant wail of police sirens began to echo through the neighborhood. The sound grew louder, cutting through the quiet suburban street. Red and blue lights started to flash through the sheer curtains of our living room window, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. Julian looked toward the window and smiled. "Right on time," he said. He looked at Chloe. "Remember what we rehearsed? You were terrified." He smelled like alcohol. "I stepped in to protect you." Chloe nodded. She forced a few tears into her eyes. Her ability to switch emotions on command was terrifying. I realized in that moment I had never really known her at all. She was a stranger, a predator wearing the face of the woman I loved. The sirens stopped right outside my front door. Car doors slammed. Heavy footsteps pounded up the front walkway. Someone began pounding on the heavy wooden door. "Police, open up," a deep voice shouted from outside. Julian rushed to the door. He threw it open, holding his hands up his face, a perfect mask of fear and relief. "Thank God you are here," Julian cried out. "He is on the floor. He is completely out of his mind. Please keep him away from us." 2 police officers rushed into my house. Their hands were resting on their holstered weapons. They looked at Julian's torn shirt. They looked at the smashed glass vase. They looked at Chloe, who was now openly weeping and trembling in the corner. And then they looked down at me. I was lying on the floor, sweating profusely, groaning in pain. I tried to speak. I tried to tell them the truth. He pushed me. I gasped. My leg. He pushed me down the stairs. The older officer did not even listen. He knelt down beside me, completely ignoring my mangled leg. He grabbed my wrists and violently twisted them behind my back. I screamed as the movement jolted my shattered tibia. "Harrison, you are under arrest for aggravated assault and domestic violence," the officer said. His voice was hard and uncompromising. The cold metal of handcuffs snapped tightly around my wrists, biting into my skin. I lay there with my face pressed against the floorboards. I watched Julian comfort my wife. He stroked her hair and whispered that everything was going to be okay. He looked over her shoulder right at me and gave me one final victorious smirk. The officers dragged me upward, forcing me to hop on my good leg. The pain was unbearable. Every movement sent shock waves of agony through my entire body. They pushed me out the front door and out into the cold night air. The neighborhood was awake. My neighbors were standing on their porches, watching me being hauled away in handcuffs like a dangerous criminal. I had no money to fight them. I had no power to stop them. Julian and Chloe had set the perfect trap, and I had walked right into it. The world believed their lies. I was completely alone. But as they shoved me into the back of the police cruiser, I realized something. They had taken my wife. They had taken my home. They had broken my body, but they had not killed me. And Julian had made one massive miscalculation. He believed my father would side with him. He believed Richard would always choose the corporate shark over the disappointing son. But Julian did not understand the one rule my father lived by. You do not touch what belongs to his family. As the police car drove away from the house I had paid for leaving my wife in the arms of the man who destroyed me, I closed my eyes and prepared for war. The sirens wailed as we drove toward the hospital, and I knew that this was not the end of my life. It was simply the beginning of their destruction. I woke up to the suffocating smell of industrial bleach and the sharp biting sting of cold metal cutting deep into my right wrist. The fluorescent lights mounted on the ceiling hummed with a harsh, blinding glare that made my skull throb with every heartbeat. I tried to lift my hand to shield my eyes from the piercing light, but my arm yanked violently against the metal bedrail. That was when I heard the distinct heavy rattle of a thick steel chain. I turned my head, my neck stiff and aching, and stared in absolute horror. I was handcuffed to the heavy frame of a hospital bed. My right leg was encased in a massive, thick plaster cast, suspended slightly in the air by a complex rigging of medical pulleys. The physical pain was a dull, constant roar radiating from the shattered bone in my tibia, straight up through my spine and into my jaw. I groaned, struggling to sit up against the stiff hospital pillows. The sudden rustling of the sterile white sheets immediately drew the attention of two uniformed police officers standing guard near the doorway. They did not look at me with an ounce of pity or concern. They looked at me with a cold, hardened disgust, like I was a monster who had finally been captured. "Save your breath, buddy," the taller officer said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the side of my bed. His hand rested casually on his utility belt, making sure I knew exactly who was in control of the room. "We already took comprehensive statements from your wife and her guest at the scene. You are officially facing felony charges for aggravated assault, domestic violence, and reckless endangerment." "I was the one assaulted," I argued, my voice cracking dry and raspy from the sterile hospital air. I looked desperately between the two officers, hoping to find a shred of reason in their eyes. He was in my bedroom with my wife. He literally threw me down a flight of stairs. Look at my leg. Look at me. Does it look like I am the one who started a fight with a guy who spends 2 hours a day in a rowing club? The second officer, a stocky man with a severe expression, stepped closer and crossed his arms over his armored chest. "Your wife and her colleague stated that you came home severely intoxicated and initiated a physical violent altercation without any warning. He claimed he pushed you away in pure self-defense to protect your wife from an unpredictable, violent outburst. And frankly, given the state you were in when we arrived, sweating, swearing, and acting entirely hostile, his story tracks perfectly with the physical evidence at the scene." "Julian is lying," I pleaded, gripping the metal bed rail with my free hand until my knuckles turned completely white. "Test my blood. There is no alcohol in my system. Test it right now and you will see the truth." "We did?" The tall officer replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "You blew a .04 on the breathalyzer at the scene. Not legally drunk enough to drive, but more than enough to fully corroborate their statement that you had been drinking heavily before returning home. And considering the massive legal team your wife's friend had waiting at the police station before we even booked you into the system, I highly suggest you stop talking without a criminal defense attorney present. Julian's people handed over digital ring camera footage from your neighbors showing you speeding into your driveway and aggressively slamming your car door. They painted a very clear, very undeniable picture of an angry, unstable, and violent man. The sheer calculation of it all hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They had boxed me into a perfect, inescapable corner. A .04. I had drank a single light beer with a fellow history teacher at a local diner 3 hours before going home. Julian knew that. He must have smelled the faint trace of it on my breath when he grabbed me by the collar in the hallway. He built his entire fabricated story around that one tiny, insignificant detail, knowing it would flawlessly frame me as the drunken aggressor in the eyes of the law. The officers stepped outside the room to speak into their radios as the heavy wooden door creaked open again. I expected a doctor or a nurse to come in and check my vitals. Instead, the person who walked into my hospital room was the absolute last person I ever expected to see. It was Sarah, Chloe's older sister. Sarah was a prominent, highly respected figure in our local suburban community. She sat on the executive parish council at the massive community church we attended every single Sunday. She organized the local charity drives. She projected a flawless public image of perfect Christian morality and unwavering family values. I genuinely believed she would see through the lies. I believed she would look at my broken body and realize that Julian was the true villain in this nightmare. I expected her to ask what happened. I expected her to seek the true story. Instead, she walked over to the side of my bed, keeping a safe, calculated distance as if I were a rabid, unpredictable animal. She was clutching a thick yellow manila folder tightly against her chest. Her face was set in a terrifying mask of righteous, unyielding judgment. Sarah. I choked out, feeling a tiny, desperate spark of hope ignite in my chest. You have to listen to me. Julian and Chloe are lying to everyone. I caught them together. He pushed me down the stairs. Stop lying, Harrison, Sarah commanded. Her voice was sharp, biting, and perfectly measured to inflict maximum emotional damage. Chloe called me sobbing hysterically from the police station an hour ago. She told me everything. She told me how you have been growing more and more resentful of her career success, how your deep financial insecurities and petty jealousy finally turned into unprovoked physical violence. I always knew your quiet, modest demeanor was just a pathetic cover for a weak, failing man. She was sleeping with him, I shouted, my voice bouncing violently off the sterile hospital walls. I caught them in our bed. He broke my leg in my own house. Do not you dare slander my sister to justify your disgusting abuse. Sarah snapped back, her eyes narrowing with pure, concentrated venom. Julian was there reviewing commercial real estate contracts with her. He is a highly respected corporate wealth manager. He is helping her advance her career. And you, in your petty, pathetic jealousy, tried to physically attack them both because you cannot handle being the inferior provider in your own marriage. She uncrossed her arms and tossed the thick manila folder onto the foot of my hospital bed. It landed with a heavy, depressing thud right next to my shattered leg. What is that? I asked, staring blankly at the brown envelope. Those are expedited divorce papers and a judge-signed temporary restraining order, Sarah stated proudly, crossing her arms again. You are now legally forbidden from coming within 500 feet of Chloe, the house, or her workplace. The police already supervised a private locksmith changing every single deadbolt on the property. You have absolutely no legal access to the home. That is my house, I protested, my chest heaving with a sudden suffocating panic. I put the entire down payment on that house from my savings. I have paid the mortgage every single month for 5 years on a public school teacher's salary. Not anymore, Sarah replied, her voice completely devoid of human empathy. Chloe's legal team has already filed an emergency motion for exclusive possession of the marital estate due to the pending domestic violence charges, and before you even think about fighting her in family court, you should know something else. Chloe drained the joint checking and savings accounts this morning, every single penny. She used your savings to pay the retainer for the most aggressive divorce attorney in the state. I felt the blood rapidly drain from my face, leaving me dizzy and completely breathless. She cannot do that. That is my teacher's salary. That is 5 years of my life savings. She can, and she absolutely did. Sarah said, a cruel, satisfied smile forming on her lips. It is considered marital property, and she is rightfully claiming financial hardship due to your impending criminal conviction. You have nothing, Harrison. You are a broke, violent criminal lying handcuffed to a hospital bed with no home and no family. The entire church congregation is actively praying for Chloe's safety from your abusive behavior. Pastor Miller even mentioned her incredible bravery in his morning email chain to the entire community. You are dead to us. You are dead to this town. Sarah turned on her heel and walked out of the room, her expensive heels clicking against the hard linoleum floor with the exact same arrogant, remorseless rhythm as Chloe's footsteps the night before. I was left completely alone in the cold, quiet room. The devastating reality of my situation crushed down on my chest like a heavy concrete block. I had $0 to my name. I was facing severe felony charges that would ensure I never taught in a classroom ever again. I was homeless, and my reputation in the community I loved had been completely incinerated by a flawless corporate lie orchestrated by a man who destroyed lives for a living. I closed my eyes, trying desperately to slow my racing heart and hold back the tears of pure frustration burning in my eyes. A few minutes later, the door opened again. A hospital billing administrator walked in holding a digital tablet and a clipboard. She looked at me with a tight, practiced customer service smile that held absolutely no genuine warmth. "Mr. Harrison," she said, pulling a freshly printed invoice from her clipboard and stepping up to the side of the bed. "I need to briefly discuss your financial account. We attempted to run your health insurance information, but it appears your premium health policy was officially canceled at midnight. Your wife, who was the primary policyholder through her real estate brokerage firm, actively removed you from the family plan. She canceled my insurance." I asked, my voice barely a whisper, unable to comprehend the sheer depth of her cruelty. "While I was bleeding in the emergency room?" "Yes, sir," the administrator confirmed, handing me the piece of standard white paper. "Because your leg required immediate emergency orthopedic surgery, the surgical insertion of 3 titanium rods and an overnight stay under mandatory police guard, your current out-of-pocket medical balance is exactly $85,000. We will need to set up a comprehensive payment plan immediately upon your medical discharge tomorrow morning. $85,000. I stared at the bold black numbers printed maliciously at the bottom of the page. The paper trembled violently in my shaking hands. Chloe had not just tried to casually ruin me, she had actively, systematically ensured my complete and total destruction. She had left me stranded in a terrifying pit of massive financial debt I could never possibly climb out of on a suspended teacher's salary. I was completely, utterly trapped in a nightmare I did not create. I reached over to the small plastic medical tray table next to my bed where the police had unceremoniously dumped my personal belongings. My house keys, which no longer worked. My leather wallet, which I now knew was entirely, completely useless. And my cell phone. I picked up the phone. The screen slowly flickered to life. The battery icon in the top right corner flashed a menacing bright red. 2% remaining. I had exactly 2% battery life to save my entire existence. I could not call a criminal defense lawyer because I had no money to pay a retainer. I could not call my fellow teachers from the middle school because the vicious church gossip had already branded me a dangerous, violent abuser. I could not call anyone I trusted because Chloe and Julian had flawlessly, systematically cut off every single social and financial lifeline I possessed in this world. There was only one single person left in the entire world who had the money, the corporate power, and the ruthless, terrifying capability to fight Julian on his own playing field. But calling him meant swallowing every single ounce of hard-earned pride I had left. It meant admitting he was right about my life choices all those years ago. It meant stepping right back into a toxic corporate world I had spent a decade trying to escape. My thumb hovered over the digital keypad. The battery suddenly dropped to 1%. The screen dimmed, threatening to plunge me into total silence. My heart pounded relentlessly against my ribs like a trapped bird trying to break free. I took a long, deep breath, bracing my soul for the crushing humiliation I knew was coming. I opened my digital contacts, scrolled past the names of people who no longer believed in me, stopped at the very bottom of the list, and pressed dial on the number saved simply under the name Richard. My estranged father. The morning light was brutal. The hospital staff wasted no time rushing me out the door the second my minimum mandatory observation period ended. Because Chloe had maliciously canceled my premium health insurance while I was bleeding in the emergency room, I was not given the lightweight fiberglass cast the surgeon originally recommended. Instead, they wrapped my shattered right leg in a heavy, clunky plaster cast that felt like it weighed 50 pounds. They handed me a pair of cheap wooden crutches that dug painfully into my armpits with every single step. A security guard literally escorted me to the sliding glass exit doors, ensuring I left the premises. I stood on the cold concrete sidewalk, shivering in the thin paper scrubs and the one oversized sweatpants leg they had cut open to fit over my massive cast. I had exactly $3.50 in my pocket, just enough for a single city bus pass. Every lurch and bump of the public transit bus sent sharp, agonizing spikes of pain shooting from my tibia straight into my skull. I stared out the dirty window, watching the familiar suburban streets of my neighborhood roll by. I just wanted to go home. I just wanted to lie down in my own bed and wake up from this terrifying nightmare. I hobbled off the bus at the corner of my subdivision. It took me 20 agonizing minutes to walk the 3 short blocks to my house. The cold rain began to fall in heavy, relentless sheets, soaking through my thin clothes and turning the plaster of my cast into a damp, freezing weight. When my house finally came into view, my heart dropped straight into my stomach. A black and white police cruiser was parked squarely in the middle of my driveway. The bright neighborhood streetlights illuminated the heavy-duty deadbolts that had been freshly installed on my front door. Chloe had not wasted a single second. I dragged my crutches up the wet driveway, desperately hoping there had been some kind of monumental misunderstanding. Before I could even reach the bottom step of the porch, the police cruiser door swung open. A heavy-set officer stepped out into the rain, resting his hand firmly on his service weapon. "Stop right there, Harrison," the officer barked over the sound of the freezing rain. "Do not take another step toward that property." I stood in the freezing downpour, my broken leg throbbing violently. "This is my house," I pleaded, my voice cracking with deep exhaustion and physical pain. "My name is on the mortgage. All of my clothes, my wallet, my entire life is inside that building." The officer did not flinch. "Your name might be on the paper, but Chloe was granted a permanent emergency restraining order by the judge at 9 o'clock this morning. You are legally barred from coming within 500 feet of this residence, her real estate office, or her person. If you take one more step forward, I will arrest you right now for violating a court order, and you will spend the rest of the year in a county jail cell waiting for a trial you cannot afford." I stared at the front window of my own house. The warm yellow light glowed comfortably from the living room. I could see the tall silhouette of Julian standing in my kitchen, drinking from my coffee mug, laughing with my wife. They had stolen my sanctuary and locked me out in the cold. I had no choice but to turn around and drag my broken body back into the freezing rain. I managed to limp half a mile down the main road until I reached a rusted metal bus stop shelter. I collapsed onto the cold, wet bench, gasping for air. The pain in my leg was so completely blinding that I physically vomited into the nearby storm drain. I reached into my damp pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I had begged the hospital nurse to charge it to exactly 15% before they kicked me out. As the screen lit up, a notification banner instantly appeared. It was an urgent email from Dr. Washington, the principal of my middle school. The subject line read, "Immediate administrative action." My stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. I opened the message and read the cold, sterile corporate language. "Dear Harrison," the email began, "it has come to the immediate attention of the school board that you are currently facing severe felony charges for aggravated assault and domestic violence. Furthermore, several prominent members of our community church leadership have formally reached out to the district superintendent expressing grave concerns regarding your violent and unpredictable behavior. Please be advised that effective immediately, you are suspended from all teaching duties without pay pending a full criminal investigation. You are prohibited from contacting any students, faculty, or stepping foot on district property." Sarah had done exactly what she promised. Chloe's sister had weaponized the entire church congregation against me. She had spun Julian's brutal, unprovoked attack into a tragic story of female survival, and she had painted me as the ultimate violent monster. They did not just want to win the divorce. They wanted to completely obliterate my ability to ever earn an honest living again. I stared at the email as the rain battered the thin metal roof of the bus shelter. Without my teaching salary, I had absolutely zero income. Chloe had already legally drained every single penny from our joint checking and savings accounts to pay her expensive lawyers. I was 36 years old, holding an $85,000 medical bill, and I was completely, entirely bankrupt. There was only one place left in the world I could possibly go. My 2012 Honda Civic was still parked at the commuter train station lot where I had left it yesterday morning before the nightmare truly began. It took me 2 terrible bus transfers and 3 hours of excruciating physical agony to finally reach the desolate asphalt lot. By the time I found my rusted car, the sun had completely set and the temperature had plummeted to near freezing. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so violently I dropped them twice into the muddy puddles. I finally unlocked the door and practically collapsed into the back seat. Getting my heavy, stiff plaster cast into the cramped space of the small sedan was pure torture. Every time the hard plaster scraped against the interior door panel, a fresh wave of white-hot agony ripped through my broken bone. I curled into a tight, miserable ball on the worn fabric of the back seat, pulling an old, scratchy, moving blanket over my freezing shoulders. This was the absolute bottom of the abyss. 24 hours ago, I had a beautiful home, a respected career, a wife I deeply loved, and a quiet future I believed in. Tonight, I was a homeless, suspected felon shivering in the back of a beat-up car parked behind a massive, brightly lit Walmart. The sheer, brutal unfairness of it all felt like a physical heavy weight crushing the air right out of my lungs. My stomach growled with a deep, hollow ache, reminding me that I had not eaten a single thing since the school cafeteria lunch the day before. The physical pain in my leg was steadily escalating. Without the strong hospital painkillers, the raw trauma of the shattered tibia was screaming for relief I simply could not afford. I pressed my face into the dirty fabric of the car seat and let the absolute devastation completely wash over me. I had played the game perfectly. I had been an honest, hard-working American citizen. I had paid my taxes, paid my mortgage, loved my wife, and dedicated my entire life to educating middle school children. And what was my ultimate reward? A broken leg, a destroyed reputation, and a life casually discarded into a freezing parking lot like yesterday's rotting garbage. Julian had won. He had ripped my entire existence away simply because he had the corporate power and the endless money to bend the fragile truth to his will. I felt a dark, heavy exhaustion pulling me under. I wanted to close my eyes and just let the freezing winter cold take me. I was completely, utterly broken. I must have drifted into a feverish, miserable sleep because I was violently startled awake by the sudden, blinding glare of high-beam headlights flooding the dark interior of my car. I threw my arm over my eyes, my heart hammering wildly against my ribs. I immediately thought it was the local police coming to impound my vehicle or arrest me for vagrancy. I struggled to sit up, the pain in my leg instantly flaring back to agonizing life. I wiped the heavy condensation off the cold glass of my rear window and peered out into the dark, sprawling parking lot. It was not a police cruiser. Parked exactly 3 feet away from my rusted Honda Civic was a sleek, immaculate black town car. The heavy luxury vehicle hummed with a quiet, intimidating power that felt completely out of place in a rundown Walmart parking lot at 2:00 in the morning. I stared at it, my breath rapidly fogging the cold window pane. Slowly and smoothly, the dark-tinted rear window of the town car rolled down. The faint glow of the nearby street lamp illuminated the sharp, terrifyingly familiar features of the man sitting in the back seat. He was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his posture rigid and commanding. It was Richard, my father. He was 68 years old, and he looked every bit the ruthless financial titan who had spent 4 demanding decades crushing his corporate enemies. He did not smile. He did not look at my broken body with an ounce of fatherly pity. His cold, calculating eyes locked onto mine through the freezing night air. The man I had sworn to never ask for help had finally arrived. And as I stared back at the father who had always considered me his greatest disappointment, I realized the true battle was just beginning. The heavy tinted window of the town car slid all the way down. The freezing rain blew into the immaculate leather interior, but my father did not even flinch. He just sat there looking at me as I shivered in the back of my rusted Honda Civic. He did not offer a warm smile. He did not ask if I was okay. He simply leaned forward slightly and issued a single command. "Get in the car." Every instinct I had told me to refuse. I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove I did not need him or his money, but the raw, throbbing pain in my shattered leg and the total emptiness in my bank account left me completely defenseless. I pushed the heavy passenger door of my Civic open. The freezing wind immediately bit through my thin paper hospital scrubs. I grabbed the cheap wooden crutches and dragged my broken body across the wet asphalt. Getting into the low, sleek back seat of the town car was an absolute nightmare. My plaster cast banged painfully against the door frame, sending fresh waves of agony straight up my spine. My father did not reach out to help me. He just watched in total silence as I struggled. I finally collapsed onto the rich, heated leather seat, pulling my mangled leg in after me. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing us inside a quiet, climate-controlled vault. The driver pulled away from the Walmart parking lot immediately. We sat in total silence for several minutes as the dark suburban streets rolled past the rain-slicked windows. I waited for him to offer some kind of parental sympathy. Instead, he stared straight ahead at the partition and delivered a brutal, unapologetic assessment of my entire existence. "I told you not to marry the real estate girl Harrison," my father said, his voice steady and cold. "I looked at her once 5 years ago and I knew exactly what she was. She is a parasite who disguises her greed as ambition. And I told you that teaching history to middle school children would leave you completely defenseless in the real world. You chose to be a soft man in a brutal corporate society. Now you are paying the exact price I warned you about." His words hit me like a physical punch to the gut. Even now, when I was homeless and broken, he could not resist pointing out my failures. I clenched my jaw, feeling the hot sting of humiliation burning in my chest. "I did not call you to ask for a lecture," I shot back, my voice trembling with cold and anger. "And I did not call you to ask for a handout. I do not want your money. I do not want a place in your firm. I do not want anything you have ever offered me." My father slowly turned his head to look at me. His gray eyes were entirely unreadable. "Then why exactly did you call me at 2 a.m? "Because Julian broke my leg," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. "I caught him in my house with my wife. He dragged me out of my bedroom and violently shoved me down my own staircase. He shattered my tibia and framed me for assault. And Chloe stood over my broken body and laughed. She laughed at me, Dad. I have lost my house, my job, and my entire life. I do not want your cash. I just want them to answer for what they did." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. My father is a ruthless capitalist. He built his wealth management firm by crushing his competitors and exploiting every single financial loophole the law allowed. He had always deeply admired Julian for his aggressive, unapologetic greed. He saw Julian as the corporate predator I refused to be. But my father is an American father first. Family blood is the one sacred line he never allows anyone to cross. I watched a subtle but terrifying shift happen in his eyes. The cold corporate disappointment vanished. It was replaced by something far more dangerous, a quiet, smoldering rage. "Julian pushed you?" My father asked, his voice, suddenly, dangerously low. "Yes," I answered, gripping the leather armrest. "He threw me down the stairs, and then he called the police and told them I was a violent drunk. He used your firm lawyers to have me arrested before I even reached the emergency room." My father slowly turned his gaze back to the front window. The muscles in his jaw flexed tightly. "Julian is the managing partner of my firm," he stated methodically, as if analyzing a complex chessboard. "He controls over $3 billion in client assets. He knows where all the corporate bodies are buried. He is deeply embedded in the absolute core of my company. So you are going to protect him? I asked, feeling a sudden crushing wave of defeat. You care more about your portfolio than your own son. My father let out a sharp, humorless breath. Do not be a fool, Harrison. I care about destroying him completely without destroying my entire life work in the process. Julian is legally insulated. He has surrounded himself with a fortress of expensive defense attorneys and corporate compliance officers. If I just fire him without absolute concrete proof of his corruption, he will walk away with a massive golden parachute, and he will take half of my top clients with him. He will win. I need to sever his head from the corporate body entirely, but to do that, I need to find the one fatal mistake he made. The town car turned off the smooth paved highway and began navigating a dark, winding gravel road that led deep into the dense pine forests. We drove for another 40 minutes, completely leaving the city lights behind until the car finally rolled to a stop in a small, muddy clearing. The driver turned off the engine. Through the rain-streaked window, I saw a decaying off-the-grid hunting cabin. Our family had owned the property for generations, but it had been abandoned for at least a decade. The wooden porch was sagging under the weight of wet, rotting leaves. There were no power lines. There was no cell service. It was a completely isolated shack sitting in the middle of absolute nowhere. My father opened his door and stepped out into the freezing mud. The driver hurried around to open my door and handed me my cheap wooden crutches. I awkwardly dragged myself out of the car, the freezing rain instantly soaking my paper scrubs. Every step toward that dark, decaying porch was a monumental physical struggle. I gritted my teeth against the blinding pain in my leg, forcing myself to keep moving. The driver unlocked the heavy wooden front door and pushed it open. The inside of the cabin smelled heavily of stale dust and old, damp wood. The only source of light was a single battery-powered camping lantern sitting on a large, scarred wooden dining table in the center of the room. My father gestured for the driver to bring something from the trunk of the town car. A moment later, the driver carried in 3 massive, heavy cardboard boxes. He set them down on the dusty dining table with a loud, solid thud. They were packed to the absolute brim with thousands of pages of old printed accounting ledgers, bank statements, and corporate financial records. I leaned heavily on my crutches, staring at the towering pile of paperwork. "What is this?" I asked, my teeth chattering from the bitter cold. "This is your only way out," my father replied. He walked over to the table and rested his hand on the top box. Julian is incredibly smart, but he is also wildly arrogant. Men like him always think they are untouchable. He hides his financial dirt right in my blind spots using dummy corporations and offshore accounts. If I bring in my corporate auditors to look at these files, Julian will immediately know. He will shred the digital evidence, delete the emails, and cover his tracks before I can even blink. My father turned to face me, his expression completely unyielding. I cannot use my people to hunt him. I have to use someone he completely dismisses, someone he thinks is entirely too weak to ever pose a threat. He thinks I am a joke, I said quietly, looking down at my heavy plaster cast. Exactly, my father said, pointing a firm finger at my chest. He thinks you are a pathetic broken middle school teacher who cannot even protect his own house. Use that arrogance against him. You teach history, Harrison. You know how to dig through archives. You know how to find missing timelines. You know how to track human behavior through paper trails. My father pulled a heavy winter coat from a nearby chair and threw it onto the table next to the boxes. There is enough chopped firewood out back to keep you from freezing to death. The pantry has enough canned food and bottled water to last exactly 14 days. There is no internet here. There are no cell phone towers. There is absolutely nothing out here to distract you. I stared at him in complete disbelief. You are leaving me out here alone. I have a shattered leg. I cannot even walk without vomiting from the pain. My father walked straight up to me, stopping just inches from my face. Julian shoved you down a flight of stairs and stole your entire life. Your wife laughed at you while you were bleeding on the floor. You want justice. This is what justice requires. It requires enduring the pain. It requires doing the absolute miserable work that no one else is willing to do. He turned and walked toward the open front door, pausing right at the threshold. The cold wind howled through the trees, blowing dead leaves onto the porch. "You have exactly 2 weeks in this cabin to find the thread Harrison," my father said, his voice echoing sharply in the empty room. "Find the exact moment Julian started stealing from me. Find the corporate shell companies. Find the undeniable proof. If you want to take back your life, you have to prove you are a survivor. I will send the car back for you in 14 days. Do not disappoint me again." My father stepped out into the freezing storm and pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind him. I heard the lock click into place. A moment later, the deep hum of the town car engine faded into the distance, leaving me completely alone in the crushing, deafening silence of the woods. I looked at the 3 heavy cardboard boxes sitting under the weak yellow glow of the camping lantern. My leg throbbed with a vicious, relentless agony. My hands were freezing. My stomach was completely empty. But for the very first time since I heard my bones snap at the bottom of my staircase, I did not feel like a helpless victim. I felt the slow burning spark of absolute vengeance. The first morning in the remote hunting cabin was a brutal, uncompromising lesson in human endurance. The temperature inside the uninsulated wooden walls had plummeted into the low 20s overnight. My breath plumed in the freezing air like thick white smoke. I lay on a bare, dusty mattress, pulling my father's heavy winter coat tightly around my shivering shoulders. My right leg, the one encased in the massive, heavy plaster cast, throbbed with a sickening, relentless rhythm. Every single beat of my heart pumped fresh agony directly through my shattered tibia. I did not have the luxury of calling a nurse for pain medication. I did not have the comfort of a heated home. If I did not get up and build a fire, I was going to literally freeze to death in this forgotten corner of the woods. I swung my heavy cast off the edge of the mattress, biting my lips so hard I tasted warm, metallic blood. I grabbed the cheap wooden crutches and hauled myself upright. The cabin floorboards groaned in the freezing silence. I dragged my broken body to the back door and pushed it open against the howling wind. My father had left a pile of chopped firewood on the back porch, but I still had to physically carry it inside. I balanced 3 heavy freezing logs on my forearms, hobbling back into the main room while my crutches slipped dangerously on the dusty floor. Every step sent a sharp, agonizing jolt of pain straight up my spine. It took me 45 excruciating minutes just to arrange the kindling and start a fire in the rusted iron stove. I found a dented tin pot, filled it with freezing water from the manual hand pump in the small kitchen, and waited for it to boil. I sat on a rigid wooden chair, staring blankly at the dancing orange flames. The physical toll was absolutely staggering, but the burning, concentrated rage in my chest kept my heart beating. Julian thought I was soft. Chloe thought I was a pathetic failure who would simply fade away into nothing. My father thought I needed to be broken to my absolute core just to be rebuilt. I was going to prove every single one of them wrong. Once the iron stove finally began to radiate a desperate warmth into the small room, I turned my attention to the large, scarred dining table. The 3 massive, heavy cardboard boxes of corporate ledgers sat there like an intimidating paper fortress. There was absolutely no cell service out here in the deep, dense pine forest. My phone was nothing more than a useless piece of dead black glass. There was no internet connection, no search engines, no digital corporate software to automatically scan the documents and highlight the anomalies. I had a cheap plastic calculator, 4 yellow highlighters, and a handful of black ink pens I found in a rotting kitchen drawer. I reached out and opened the first heavy cardboard box. A thick cloud of stale paper dust rose into the freezing air. I pulled out a massive stack of dense printed financial records from my father's wealth management firm. To an ordinary person looking from the outside, it would look like a meaningless, impossible ocean of numbers, dates, and complex corporate jargon. It was deliberately designed to confuse. It was designed to completely overwhelm any state auditor or financial regulator who dared to look too closely at the firm's daily operations. But Julian and my father had forgotten one crucial fundamental detail about my chosen profession. I was a public school history teacher. I had spent my entire adult life studying and analyzing primary sources. I used to teach my 8th grade students about the ruthless industrial tycoons of the 19th century. I taught them how to look past the official polished narratives and find the brutal truth hidden in the margins of history. I knew exactly how to sift through decades of complex, intentionally misleading records to find the hidden narrative beneath the surface. I knew how to cross-reference dates, track human migrations, and follow the slow, deliberate movement of vital resources. Financial corruption is not simply a mathematical error. It is a deeply behavioral problem. It is a series of deliberate human choices, and human choices always leave a distinct traceable footprint. Julian was a modern predator, but his methods were as old as time. I cleared the dusty table and began meticulously organizing the towering stacks of ledgers by fiscal year and client portfolio. I created a massive master timeline on the blank backs of old forgotten calendar pages. Hour after hour, I sat under the weak yellow glow of the battery-powered camping lantern, tracing the complex flow of millions of dollars. My back ached with a deep, fiery tension. My fingers cramped intensely from constantly writing and highlighting. The dull, throbbing pain in my shattered leg frequently made me nauseous, but I flatly refused to stop. I drank boiling hot water to keep my core body temperature up, and ate cold, condensed canned soup straight from the tin. I did not sleep for the first 48 hours. I simply highlighted, cross-referenced, and calculated until my vision blurred. By the morning of the 4th day, the chaotic ocean of printed numbers began to take a very definite, very terrifying shape. I started noticing small, subtle inconsistencies buried deep within the routine quarterly financial reports. Julian was the managing partner of the firm. He had unilateral, unsupervised control over the firm's most vulnerable accounts. Specifically, he controlled the retirement portfolios of the oldest clients. These were honest, hard-working people who had spent 40 years sweating in factories, hospitals, and construction sites. People who implicitly trusted my father's prestigious firm to completely protect their hard-earned federal pensions and their modest 401k accounts. I dragged my yellow highlighter across a specific line item in a file dated exactly 3 years ago. It was vaguely labeled as an external portfolio restructuring fee. It was a relatively modest charge of just $5,000. In a corporate retirement portfolio worth $1 million, a $5,000 fee barely registers as a blip on the radar. But then I found the exact same vague restructuring fee applied to another elderly client. And then another. And then another. The exact same charge systematically billed on the exact same day across 80 different accounts. I frantically pulled out the second heavy box of ledgers and began hunting exclusively for that specific billing code. My breath caught sharply in my throat as the sinister pattern exploded across the pages in bright yellow ink. Julian was not just casually skimming a few $1,000s off the top to fund his lavish lifestyle. He was systematically bleeding the federal pension funds of hundreds of vulnerable elderly clients entirely dry. He was routinely billing them for massive phantom consulting fees and entirely fabricated asset management costs. Because the global stock market was experiencing a steady upward trend during those specific years, the clients never noticed the missing funds. Their quarterly statements still showed modest financial growth perfectly, masking the terrifying fact that Julian was quietly and ruthlessly siphoning off their principal retirement balances month after month. I furiously punched the highlighted numbers into my cheap plastic calculator. The small plastic buttons clicked loudly in the silent, freezing cabin. $10,000 here. $50,000 there. $500,000 completely drained in a single financial quarter. I added up the columns, my hands shaking more and more with every single page I turned. The final sum staring back at me on the small digital screen was absolutely staggering. It was $24 million. Julian had successfully embezzled $24 million directly from the very people who could least afford to lose it. He was stealing the livelihoods of innocent people to buy custom suits and imported sports cars. My chest heaved as the sheer magnitude of the crime washed over me. But stealing the money from the accounts was only half the crime. Julian had to actually move the stolen funds out of the tightly monitored corporate accounts without triggering an internal compliance audit or a massive alert from the Securities and Exchange Commission. He desperately needed a ghost vendor. He needed a completely untraceable destination to effectively launder the stolen cash and legitimize the phantom consulting fees he was charging the elderly clients. I aggressively flipped back through the hundreds of highlighted pages, desperately searching for the receiving accounts. I traced the money out of the firm and watched where it landed. Every single fabricated consulting fee, every single stolen pension dollar was systematically wired directly to a mysterious external vendor. The corporate entity was listed only under the name C&J Holdings Limited. I stared at the heavily highlighted name, C&J Holdings. According to the printed ledgers, it was incorporated in Delaware, a state famously known for shielding corporate ownership identities from public records. It was the perfect, invisible black hole for stolen money. It was brilliant and flawless. But Julian had made one fatal, arrogant mistake. In his absolute unshakable certainty that no one would ever manually audit these specific physical paper files, he had carelessly authorized a direct wire transfer to a secondary escrow account linked to C&J Holdings. He assumed my father was too busy running the empire to look at the ground floor, and he assumed I was too stupid to ever see the truth. I stared at the printed routing number on the escrow transfer document. My heart stopped beating for a full second. I recognized that specific routing number. I recognized the specific regional bank branch listed on the transfer confirmation. It was the exact same local luxury bank where my wife maintained her primary business accounts for her high-end real estate firm. I had personally driven her to that exact branch dozens of times over the past 5 years. My blood turned to absolute ice. The bright yellow highlighter slipped from my trembling fingers and dropped onto the dusty wooden table, rolling slowly until it hit the edge and fell to the floor. C&J, Chloe and Julian. I frantically pulled the third and final box toward me, ripping the heavy cardboard lid open with shaking hands. I dug fiercely through the final year of corporate real estate acquisitions my father had included, desperately searching for the corresponding public property records. My eyes scanned the dense legal text until they locked onto the final undeniable piece of the puzzle. There it was in bold black ink. C&J Holdings had recently purchased a massive diverse portfolio of high-end commercial luxury properties across the entire state. Chloe was a premier luxury real estate agent. She possessed the exact specialized legal licenses required to process massive commercial real estate transactions. She had the legal authority and the professional access to move millions of dollars through unregulated property escrow accounts. She was using her position to successfully convert stolen, untraceable cash into highly lucrative physical real estate assets. She was taking the stolen pension money and washing it completely clean through luxury mansions and commercial high-rises. They were making the stolen millions entirely legitimate. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs, echoing loudly in the silent, freezing cabin. The crushing, heavy weight of the absolute truth completely paralyzed me. This entire nightmare was never just a pathetic, tragic suburban affair. Julian had not violently pushed me down those stairs simply because I caught him sleeping with my status-obsessed wife. He did not break my leg in a crime of passion. He tried to physically destroy my life and throw me in prison because I had unknowingly walked right into the middle of a massive $24 million federal money laundering operation. I was the only witness to their vulnerability, and the woman I had promised to love and protect was his primary partner in crime. Driving the 2012 Civic with a broken right leg meant I had to awkwardly contort my body across the center console and use my left foot for both the gas and the brake. Every single time I pressed the pedal, my shattered right tibia sent a blinding shockwave of white-hot pain straight up my thigh and into my lower back. The heavy plaster cast rested awkwardly against the floorboard, useless and agonizing. The heater in my rusted car had died 3 years ago, so my breath plumed in the freezing air of the cabin as I navigated the dark, winding back roads. I drove for over an hour, leaving the dense pine forest behind and creeping back toward the desolate industrial outskirts of the city. My destination was a secluded 24-hour truck stop diner located right off the interstate, far away from the wealthy suburban enclaves where my wife and Julian spent their evenings. The neon sign of the diner buzzed with a harsh, flickering red light cutting through the freezing winter rain. I parked the car as close to the entrance as possible, putting the vehicle in park with a trembling hand. I reached into the passenger seat and grabbed the thick manila folders I had carefully compiled from the massive cardboard boxes of ledgers. These folders contained the master timeline, the highlighted escrow transfers, and the undeniable proof of a $24 million embezzlement scheme. I clutched them tightly against my chest, grabbed my cheap wooden crutches, and dragged my broken body out into the storm. The bell above the diner door chimed weakly as I hobbled inside. The air was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and old grease. The diner was completely empty except for a tired waitress wiping down the front counter and a single customer sitting in the absolute back corner booth. My father looked entirely alien in this rundown environment. He was wearing a flawless navy blue overcoat over his custom-tailored suit, sitting perfectly upright on the cracked vinyl seating. He had a cup of black coffee in front of him that he had not touched. As I dragged my crutches across the sticky linoleum floor, he watched me with those piercing, calculating gray eyes. I did not ask for help. I pulled out the chair opposite him, dropped the heavy folders onto the scratched Formica table, and awkwardly maneuvered my heavy cast under the booth. I was shivering violently, my paper hospital scrubs damp from the rain, but my hands were completely steady. "Did you find it?" my father asked, his voice perfectly level, betraying absolutely no emotion. I did not just find a thread. I replied, my voice rough and exhausted. "I found the entire sweater, and I found exactly how they are unraveling your company." I opened the first folder and pushed a stack of densely highlighted financial documents across the table. For the first time in my entire life, I did not feel intimidated by the financial titan sitting across from me. I was a history teacher. I knew how to present a heavily researched timeline. I pointed to the very first yellow highlighted row. "It started exactly 36 months ago," I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional. "Julian began quietly skimming the retirement portfolios of your oldest, most vulnerable clients. He targeted the federal pensions and the 401k accounts that belonged to people who were completely hands-off with their money. He systematically generated phantom consulting fees and fabricated asset management costs. Because the global market was experiencing a steady upward trend, the clients simply saw modest gains on their quarterly statements. They never realized Julian was aggressively draining their principal balances. He stole $24 million right under your nose." My father stared at the highlighted numbers. I watched his eyes dart across the page, instantly comprehending the complex financial billing codes. A dark, furious shadow crossed his weathered face. He reached out and traced the edge of the paper with his index finger. "This is impossible," my father murmured, his voice dropping an entire octave. "My internal compliance department runs random mandatory audits on these specific portfolios every single quarter. They would have flagged these massive unauthorized fees immediately. Julian could not have bypassed the security protocols without triggering a massive red flag in the system." "He did not bypass your compliance department," I said, pulling the second folder open and sliding the escrow transfer receipts across the table. "He actively manipulated it. Look at the receiving accounts. He did not wire the stolen money to personal offshore accounts. He wired the funds directly to a domestic corporate entity registered as C&J Holdings. My father frowned deeply, reading the corporate name aloud. C&J Holdings, Chloe and Julian. I clarified, watching the realization hit him like a physical blow. The money did not disappear into the void. It went straight into domestic corporate real estate escrow accounts. Chloe is a premier luxury real estate broker. She holds the specialized licenses required to process massive, unregulated commercial property transactions. Julian stole the pension funds and wired them into Chloe's professional escrow accounts. Chloe then used that stolen cash to completely purchase a massive portfolio of high-end commercial properties and luxury mansions across the state. They took $24 million of dirty money and washed it entirely clean through the American real estate market. My father sat back in the cracked vinyl booth. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. For 40 years, he had built a reputation as the smartest, most ruthless financial mind in the city. He prided himself on knowing every single detail of his empire. Now he was staring at undeniable absolute proof that his chosen protege had turned his prestigious wealth management firm into a massive criminal money laundering syndicate. But the horror was not simply about the stolen money. I watched my father frantically flip through the remaining transfer documents, his hands moving with a sudden desperate urgency. He pulled a specific ledger page close to his face, his eyes widening in absolute genuine terror. "No," my father whispered, his voice cracking with a fear I had never ever heard him use before. "No, he did not just steal from the clients. Look at the routing pathways, Harrison. Look at where the money originated before it was transferred to the real estate escrow accounts." I leaned forward, confused by his sudden panic. "He wired it from the client trust accounts. I highlighted it right there. He commingled the funds," my father said, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. "He did not just transfer the stolen money directly from the client accounts to your wife's shell company. That would be too obvious. He routed the stolen pension money through our primary foundational corporate liquidity accounts first. He mixed the stolen money with the firm's legitimate operational capital before sending it out the back door." I stared at him, trying to grasp the massive legal implications of what he was saying. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means the cancer is everywhere," my father said, rubbing his face aggressively with both hands. In the eyes of the American financial justice system, Julian did not just use my firm to steal money. He actively weaponized the firm's central nervous system to launder it. The stolen funds are now permanently entirely indistinguishable from our legitimate corporate profits. He tied his massive embezzlement scheme directly to the foundational accounts that keep this entire empire running. "Then we take this to the police," I said, firmly tapping the folders. "We take it to the authorities. We give them the proof, and we watch Julian and Chloe go to federal prison for the rest of their natural lives." My father let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded more like a death rattle. "You do not understand how the federal government works, Harrison. This is not a simple robbery. This is a $24 million federal wire fraud and money laundering conspiracy involving vulnerable elderly citizens. If I walk into the local field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation tomorrow morning and hand them these exact ledgers, they are not just going to politely arrest Julian and your wife." He leaned across the table, his gray eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. "The moment the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI see that Julian commingled the stolen funds with my primary operational accounts, they will immediately classify my entire wealth management firm as an active, ongoing criminal enterprise. They will utilize federal racketeering laws. They will freeze every single corporate asset I possess. They will seize the firm. They will lock the doors. They will freeze my personal bank accounts, my retirement portfolios, and my stock options because they will automatically assume I was the mastermind behind the entire operation." I sat perfectly still, absorbing the crushing, devastating reality of the situation. "To take Julian down, you have to completely destroy your own company." My father nodded slowly, staring down at his cold, untouched coffee. "I spent 40 years of my life bleeding for this firm. I crushed my competitors. I alienated my family. I pushed you away because you did not fit the corporate mold I desperately wanted to build. This firm is my legacy. It is the only thing I have ever truly loved. And if I expose Julian, I am essentially lighting a match and burning 40 years of my absolute life work to the ground. I will lose my wealth. I will lose my reputation. I will likely face years of grueling federal investigations just to completely clear my own name. I will be left with nothing. The silence in the diner was deafening. The only sound was the heavy rain violently lashing against the thin glass window panes. I looked at the man sitting across from me. He was a ruthless capitalist who had always prioritized his wealth over his own blood. He had always chosen his empire over his son. Now the universe had cornered him into making the ultimate, absolutely terrifying choice. He could easily sweep this under the rug. He could quietly fire Julian, bury the evidence, and protect his massive fortune. But doing so meant letting the man who shattered my leg and destroyed my life walk away completely unpunished. It meant letting my viciously manipulative wife win. I did not beg him. I did not plead for his help. I slowly closed the manila folders and pulled them back toward my side of the table. I understand, I said, my voice quiet and utterly defeated. I am not going to ask you to destroy your life for me. I will figure out another way to fight them. My father did not move. He kept his eyes fixed on the scratched table. Suddenly, a sharp, harsh buzzing sound interrupted the heavy silence. My father reached into his tailored coat pocket and pulled out his sleek corporate smartphone. The screen illuminated his face with a cold blue light. He stared at the screen for a long, agonizing moment. A strange, dark emotion washed over his features. He silently turned the phone around and placed it flat on the table facing me. It was a direct text message from Julian. The words on the bright screen were dripping with an absolutely sickening level of corporate arrogance and unearned victory. Everything is set for the succession gala next week. Richard. The text message read, I have the new corporate initiatives ready to present to the board of directors. Are you ready to finally hand over the keys to the kingdom? I stared at the message, feeling a wave of pure physical nausea twist in my empty stomach. Julian was standing in my house, sleeping with my wife and casually preparing to take over my father's entire financial empire. He firmly believed he had completely outsmarted everyone in his path. He believed he was an untouchable god. My father slowly reached out and retrieved his phone. He did not reply to the message. He simply clicked the screen dark and placed the device face down on the table. He looked up and let his gaze slowly travel down to my shattered leg hidden beneath the table in a heavy, miserable plaster cast. He looked at my damp paper hospital scrubs. He looked at my pale, exhausted face. He saw the son he had constantly, relentlessly dismissed as a weak failure. And he finally saw the unyielding, undeniable strength it took for me to survive. My father let out a long, slow breath. He reached across the table and firmly placed his large hand directly over the thick manila folders, completely stopping me from pulling them away. Julian thinks he is the smartest man in the world. My father said, his voice steady, entirely devoid of fear, and filled with a cold, terrifying resolve. He thinks he can bleed my clients dry. He thinks he can steal my legacy. And he thinks he can physically break my son and simply walk away with the crown. My father stood up from the cracked vinyl booth towering over the table. He buttoned his navy blue overcoat and looked me dead in the eye. Let us burn my empire to the ground. I sat on the edge of a sagging mattress in a cheap roadside motel room. My father had rented the room using cash and a fake name to keep me completely hidden from Julian and his army of corporate lawyers. My broken leg throbbed with a dull, heavy ache inside the filthy plaster cast. I had walked to a nearby gas station earlier that morning using my cheap wooden crutches to buy a prepaid smartphone. I needed to see what the outside world looked like while I was buried in the shadows. I connected to the weak, unsecured internet of the motel and opened my social media accounts. What I saw made my stomach turn into a tight, painful knot. Julian and Chloe were absolutely basking in their fabricated victory. They were not even trying to hide their relationship from the public anymore. Chloe had posted a perfectly curated video of my own living room. The house I had painstakingly saved for on a modest public school teacher salary was completely unrecognizable. She was actively redecorating the entire property using Julian's endless supply of stolen money. I watched her point out imported Italian leather sofas and custom-cut marble countertops. She proudly showcased a massive crystal chandelier hanging in the entryway where I had once helped her paint the walls. She was living the billionaire lifestyle she had always desperately craved, and she was doing it inside the very walls I had built with my own hands. The betrayal did not stop with the expensive new furniture. I clicked on a highly shared public post from her older sister Sarah. Sarah had organized a massive prayer circle at our local community church. She posted a high-resolution photograph of Chloe standing at the church altar, looking fragile and perfectly victimized, holding a tissue to her eyes. The lengthy caption praised Chloe as a brave, strong survivor of brutal domestic violence. Sarah wrote about how the entire congregation was rallying behind her sister to protect her from my violent, unpredictable rage. They had completely successfully rewritten my history. I was suddenly a dangerous monster, and Julian was the wealthy, heroic savior who had valiantly rescued her from my abuse. Reading the supportive comments from people I had known for years, from parents of students I had taught, made me physically sick. Julian was playing his role flawlessly. I found a photo he had uploaded from an exclusive downtown bespoke tailor. He was standing in front of a full-length mirror being fitted for a custom midnight blue tuxedo. He looked incredibly sharp, arrogant, and completely unbothered by the fact that he had shattered a man's leg and stolen his life. The caption beneath the photo read, "Preparing for the biggest night of my professional career." He was talking about the upcoming Succession Gala. In just a few short days, my father was scheduled to stand on a grand stage in front of hundreds of elite financial executives and officially name Julian the new chief executive officer of the wealth management firm. Julian truly believed he had won. He believed he had stolen my wife, taken my home, and conquered my father's massive empire without leaving a single trace of his crimes. He felt completely, totally untouchable. I locked the phone screen and tossed it onto the cheap motel bedspread. I knew the absolute truth about their $24 million money laundering operation, but knowing the truth and surviving their aggressive legal assault were two entirely different things. A loud, sharp knock at the motel door snapped me out of my dark thoughts. I grabbed my wooden crutches and hobbled painfully over to the door. I looked through the scratched peephole and saw a man in a courier uniform holding a thick white envelope. My heart hammered against my ribs. Julian and Chloe had tracked me down. I opened the door, and the courier shoved the heavy envelope into my chest without saying a single word before turning and walking away. I locked the door and limped back to the bed, tearing the thick paper open with shaking hands. It was a massive, intimidating legal packet from the most expensive cutthroat family law firm in the state. I read through the dense legal jargon and felt the air completely leave my lungs. It was an expedited divorce decree and a brutal civil lawsuit. Chloe was not just taking my house and my remaining savings. She was coming after the absolute last thing I possessed in the world. She was demanding the total surrender of my state teacher pension to cover her severe emotional distress and ongoing trauma therapy. I had worked for 10 long years in the public school system building that modest retirement fund. It was the only financial security I had left to my name. But the legal packet did not just ask for my money. It contained a direct, terrifying threat from her high-priced lawyers. Attached to the civil lawsuit was a formal legal letter stating that if I did not sign away my pension and agree to all the divorce terms within 48 hours, they would personally contact the district attorney. They promised to use their immense political influence to push for the maximum possible prison sentence on my pending felony assault charges. They explicitly stated they would use their vast financial resources to ensure I spent the next 10 years in a maximum security state prison. They were holding my physical freedom hostage to strip me down to absolute nothingness. My hands shook violently as I held the legal documents. A few days ago, this aggressive threat would have completely broken me. I would have signed anything just to avoid going to prison for a crime I did not commit. I would have surrendered my pension and walked away a ruined homeless man. But everything was entirely different now. I possessed the corporate ledgers. I knew exactly where Julian and Chloe had hidden the stolen federal pension funds. I knew that their entire wealthy existence was built on a massive, crumbling foundation of wire fraud and federal embezzlement. I picked up my prepaid smartphone and dialed the phone number printed at the top of the intimidating legal letter. A receptionist answered and quickly transferred me to the senior partner representing Chloe. "This is Harrison," I said, my voice surprisingly calm and steady despite the chaos swirling in my head. "I received your packet." The lawyer let out a smug, arrogant sigh through the receiver. "Good," he said. "I strongly advise you to sign every single page and return it to my office by tomorrow morning. My client has been incredibly generous in offering you this settlement instead of leaving you with a lifetime of civil debt. If you force us to litigate this in a courtroom, we will bury you under the jail, Harrison. You do not have the financial resources to survive a war with us." Suddenly, a second voice chimed in over the line. It was Chloe. She was sitting in the lawyer's office, listening on speakerphone. "Just sign the papers, Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Do not drag this out. You are a broke, suspended middle school teacher with a felony record and a broken leg. You have absolutely no leverage here. Julian and I are moving on with our lives and building a real future together. Do not make us ruin you completely." I closed my eyes and pictured her sitting in that expensive leather chair, thinking she had completely outsmarted the world. I pictured Julian standing next to her wearing a $5,000 suit, bought with stolen retirement money from elderly citizens. "You took my house," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "You drained my life savings. You laughed while your lover shoved me down a flight of stairs and shattered my leg. And now you want the meager pension I earned teaching history to public school kids. You owe me for the trauma you caused me." Chloe snapped back, her voice rising with fake righteous anger. "You are lucky we are giving you a chance to settle this quietly outside of the public eye. If you do not sign those papers right now, I promise you I will stand on the witness stand and watch the judge lock you in a cage." I gripped the phone tightly. I felt a cold, powerful wave of absolute certainty wash over my entire body. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell or threaten them back. I knew exactly what was coming for them. "I am not signing anything," I said, my words cutting through the phone line like sharp glass. "You can keep the house, Chloe. You can keep the expensive furniture and the neighborhood church gossip. But I am not giving you my pension. You are going to have to face me in the courtroom at the final hearing." Chloe let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed loudly through the small motel room. "You are a pathetic fool, Harrison. You are going to walk into that courtroom with a cheap public defender and a pair of wooden crutches. We are going to completely obliterate you. I will make sure you never see the light of day again." "I will see you in court, Chloe," I replied, and I ended the call. I dropped the device onto the mattress. My heart was racing, but my mind was completely clear. They thought they had backed a helpless, terrified animal into a corner. They had absolutely no idea that I was walking into that courtroom with the full weight of my father's entire financial empire behind me. They thought they were holding all the winning cards, but they were standing directly on a fragile trapdoor that was about to swing wide open. Later that evening, the heavy wooden door of my motel room clicked open. My father walked in, bringing a sharp blast of freezing winter air with him. He looked completely exhausted. The deep lines on his face seemed far more pronounced, and his silver hair was slightly disheveled. He took off his heavy navy blue overcoat and tossed it onto the single armchair in the corner of the room. He did not ask how I was doing. He simply pulled a thick leather-bound portfolio from his briefcase and laid it gently on the small table next to my bed. Julian sent the final invitations for the succession gala. My father said, his voice low and gravelly. He is expecting me to stand up and hand over the absolute control of the wealth management firm this weekend. He thinks he has completely insulated himself from any possible audit. He has no idea that I spent the last 3 days meticulously preparing for a massive federal strike. I looked at the heavy leather portfolio on the table. "What is that?" I asked, shifting my heavy plaster cast to ease the constant throbbing pain in my leg. My father looked down at the portfolio and then looked directly into my eyes. "When I hand those ledgers over to the federal authorities, they are going to execute a massive coordinated raid on my corporate headquarters. The government will immediately freeze every single corporate asset tied to my name. They will seize my bank accounts, my commercial properties, and my investments under federal racketeering protocols. I will lose access to the wealth I spent 4 decades building." He stepped closer to the bed. "But I am not going to let Julian leave you with nothing. Over the past 72 hours, I have been quietly and systematically liquidating my completely clean personal assets. The money that was never ever touched by Julian or his ghost companies. I have transferred everything into a secure, unbreakable trust fund entirely in your name." I stared at him in complete shock. "You gave me your personal money. I protected my family." My father corrected, his voice firm and unwavering. "The federal government will not be able to touch that specific trust. It is completely legally isolated from the firm and the pending investigations. When the dust finally settles and Julian is sitting in a federal prison cell, you will have the financial freedom to build whatever life you choose. You proved to me that you are infinitely stronger than the corporate wolves I surrounded myself with." He zipped up his briefcase and walked back toward the motel door. He stopped with his hand resting on the brass doorknob. "Rest your leg, Harrison," my father said, looking back at me one final time. "Julian thinks he has already won the war. Let him put on his custom tuxedo and drink his expensive champagne. Because when we walk into that courtroom next week, we are going to burn his illusion of victory straight to the ground." I sat in the absolute darkness of the country club parking lot, shivering slightly in the passenger seat of my father's black town car. The heavy freezing rain from the previous week had given way to a bitter, violently cold night, but I rolled the tinted window down a fraction of an inch anyway. I needed the sharp, freezing air to keep me completely alert. Resting on the plush leather center console between me and my father's trusted private investigator was a small digital audio receiver. The glowing green light on the device was the only illumination in the dark cabin of the vehicle. Through the high-quality noise-canceling headphones pressed tightly against my ears, I could hear the crystal-clear audio of the lavish succession gala happening inside the massive, brightly lit ballroom just 100 yards away. My father was wearing a microscopic listening device carefully concealed inside the lapel of his custom tuxedo. Every single clink of expensive crystal champagne flutes, every round of polite corporate applause, and every word spoken at the head table was transmitted directly into my ears. I closed my eyes and listened as my father stepped up to the grand microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," my father said, his voice echoing smoothly through the massive ballroom speakers. "For 40 years, I have built this wealth management firm from the ground up. I have treated it as my own flesh and blood. But true leadership is knowing exactly when to step aside and exactly who to trust with the future of the empire." The ballroom fell into a respectful, absolute silence. I gripped the dark fabric of my trousers, my knuckles turning white as I waited for the trap to spring. Tonight, my father continued injecting the perfect amount of fabricated pride into his tone. "I am officially naming Julian as the new chief executive officer of our firm. He possesses a specific kind of hunger. He sees the financial blind spots that others easily miss. He is exactly the kind of ruthless visionary this company desperately needs to survive the next 40 years. A thunderous wave of applause erupted through my headphones. People were loudly cheering for a man who had systematically robbed elderly pensioners blind. I heard the loud scrape of a heavy wooden chair as Julian stood up to take the microphone. When he began to speak, his voice was completely saturated with a sickening, unearned arrogance. "Thank you, Richard," Julian said, his voice perfectly modulated for a wealthy elite crowd. "You have been far more than a mentor to me. You have been the true father I always needed. And I promise you, I will treat this massive company with the exact same family values you have always championed. Loyalty, unyielding strength, and the absolute unwavering commitment to protecting those we love." I felt a hard, sick lump form deep in my throat. The sheer staggering hypocrisy of his empty words made me want to rip the heavy headphones off my skull. He was preaching about family values exactly 1 week after he had invaded my private home, slept with my wife, and violently shattered my leg. "And speaking of family," Julian continued, lowering his voice to a smooth, intimate register, "I want to personally thank the beautiful, incredible woman sitting in the front row tonight. Chloe, your unwavering support through this difficult transition has been my guiding light. You are a survivor. You are a true beacon of strength, and I cannot wait to build our incredible, wealthy future together." More polite applause echoed loudly through the receiver. I could perfectly picture Chloe sitting at the VIP table wearing a designer evening gown paid for with stolen retirement funds, blushing and soaking in the fabricated admiration of the elite crowd. She was playing the brave victim while plotting to completely steal my meager teacher pension. They were both absolutely swimming in their own toxic delusion. The formal speeches finally concluded and the loud background noise of a live jazz band began to play. I listened intently as my father navigated through the sea of wealthy guests. I heard the muffled sounds of handshakes and corporate congratulations. Then I heard my father lean in very close to Julian. "Julian," my father said, his voice dropping to a quiet, confidential whisper. "Bring your drink. Let us step into the private VIP lounge for a moment. I have a very special bottle of aged scotch I want to open just for the two of us." "Of course," Richard Julian replied eagerly. I heard the heavy wooden door of the private lounge click shut suddenly, cutting off the loud, lively music and the chatter of the ballroom. The audio feed became terrifyingly clear. I held my breath, pressing the headphones tighter against my cold ears. This was the exact moment we had meticulously planned for. If Julian suspected anything, if he held back a single tiny detail, the entire trap would fall apart and my father would lose his massive empire for absolutely nothing. My father poured 2 glasses of scotch. I heard the heavy glass clink against the polished wooden table. "You gave a brilliant speech out there, Julian," my father said, taking a slow, calculated sip of his drink. "But you and I both know speeches are just theater for the board of directors. I chose you for this powerful position because you do not let morality get in the way of massive profits. I chose you because you are not weak like my son." Hearing my father actually say those brutal words, even knowing it was a carefully calculated performance, sent a sharp, painful sting directly through my chest. But it worked flawlessly. Julian let out a low, arrogant chuckle. "Harrison is a naive fool," Julian said, his voice dripping with absolute disgusting contempt. "He honestly believes playing by the rules gets you somewhere in this life. He is sitting in a cheap, dirty motel right now with a broken leg and absolutely no future because he refused to take what was his. I took his wife, I took his house, and tomorrow morning in federal court I am going to take his freedom." "You handled the domestic issue perfectly," my father replied seamlessly, stroking Julian's massive, fragile ego. "But that is not what I want to drink to tonight. I want to drink to your true financial masterpiece. I want to drink to the $24 million. The audio feed went dead silent for exactly 3 agonizing seconds. My heart completely stopped beating. I thought Julian was going to realize he was being played. I thought he was going to walk out the door. Instead, Julian let out a long, deeply satisfied sigh of pride. "You found the ledger anomalies?" Julian asked, his tone completely devoid of fear. He sounded incredibly proud. He sounded like a brilliant student waiting for a gold star from his favorite wealthy teacher. "I found them 3 days ago." my father said, keeping his voice perfectly smoothly level. And I have to admit, Julian, I am genuinely wildly impressed. I built this company, and even I did not see how easily you siphoned the funds from the elderly client portfolios. Charging phantom consulting fees to the vulnerable pension accounts while the market was trending upward was a stroke of absolute financial genius. They never even noticed the missing principal balances. It was remarkably easy, Julian bragged, the expensive alcohol clearly loosening his arrogant tongue. Those old factory workers and retired public nurses do not read the dense fine print on their quarterly statements. As long as they see a tiny fraction of growth, they blindly trust us to manage the rest. I simply restructured their deadweight assets into active capital for myself. But stealing it is the easy part, my father pressed, leaning in closer to the hidden microphone. Moving it out of my central liquidity accounts without triggering a massive federal audit is what makes you the perfect CEO. How exactly did you wash the money clean, Julian? I need to know the entire structure before I hand over the complete administrative control tomorrow morning. Julian took another long sip of his expensive scotch. I could hear the ice clinking loudly against his crystal glass. I used Chloe. Julian confessed, sealing his own devastating fate with every single spoken word. She is a highly licensed commercial real estate broker. I established a domestic corporate shell entity called C&J Holdings. I wired the stolen pension funds directly from your firm liquidity accounts into her completely unregulated real estate escrow accounts. Once the stolen cash was sitting safely in the private escrow accounts, Chloe used it to aggressively purchase high-end commercial properties and luxury residential mansions across the entire state. You bought physical real estate with the stolen federal pensions, my father asked, prompting Julian to explicitly confirm the money laundering structure on tape. Exactly, Julian replied, his voice echoing with supreme unbothered arrogance. We successfully converted $24 million of dirty, traceable cash into completely clean physical assets. The properties are all legally registered under Chloe's various limited liability companies. It is a completely bulletproof system, Richard. The Securities and Exchange Commission has absolutely no legal jurisdiction over private real estate escrow transfers. We washed the money right under their noses, and there is absolutely no paper trail connecting the stolen funds directly to my name. It is a masterpiece, my father agreed, his voice thick with a dark, hidden, terrifying meaning. You and Chloe make quite the formidable team. We do, Julian agreed, laughing softly into his glass. We took absolutely everything from Harrison, and we took $24 million from your blind clients. And the absolute best part is nobody will ever know. I reached out with a violently trembling hand and pressed the stop button on the digital audio receiver. The glowing green light turned a solid bright red, indicating the recording was officially saved, locked, and securely encrypted. I pulled the heavy headphones off my ears and let out a long, shaky, exhausted breath. A hot tear of pure adrenaline and overwhelming relief slid down my face. We had it. We had the absolute, undeniable recorded proof of a massive federal crime explicitly detailed by the mastermind himself. I looked over at the private investigator sitting quietly in the driver's seat. He gave me a single grim nod, confirming he had immediately backed up the heavy audio file to a secure remote cloud server. The evidence was now entirely indestructible. I grabbed my cheap wooden crutches and pushed my heavy passenger door open. The freezing night air hit my face, but I did not feel the bitter, stinging cold anymore. I dragged my heavy plaster cast across the wet asphalt of the parking lot, moving slowly and deliberately toward the grand entrance of the elite country club. I did not care that I was wearing faded, loose sweatpants and a cheap, worn jacket. I did not care that my hair was damp from the freezing rain. I pulled open the heavy glass doors and limped into the opulent marble foyer of the club. The air smelled warmly of expensive catering and fresh lilies. Through the massive open double doors leading directly into the main ballroom, I could see the glittering sea of wealthy elites. The jazz band was playing a lively, upbeat tune. Waiters in crisp white uniforms were circulating rapidly with silver trays of champagne. I stood perfectly still in the dark, quiet shadows just outside the ballroom doors. I scanned the massive, crowded room until I finally found them. Julian was standing near the center of the room, surrounded tightly by a circle of admiring board members. He was smiling widely, holding a fresh drink, completely convinced he was the most powerful, untouchable man on the planet. Chloe was standing right beside him, wearing a dazzling diamond necklace paid for by stolen retirement funds, laughing brightly at a joke someone had just told. Then the wealthy crowd parted slightly, and I saw my father. He was standing completely alone near the edge of the grand stage, holding his empty crystal glass. He looked slowly across the massive ballroom, his sharp gray eyes scanning the shadows near the entrance until they locked entirely directly onto mine. We stared at each other silently across the vast distance of 100 wealthy, oblivious people. I did not smile. I simply adjusted my tight grip on my wooden crutches and held his heavy gaze. My father looked at my broken casted leg and then looked straight up at my pale face. Slowly, very deliberately, my father gave me a single silent nod. The deadly trap was officially completely locked. The evidence was secured. My father turned his back on the massive empire he had spent 40 years building and walked away from the crowd. The agonizing, excruciating wait was finally over. The morning of my combined criminal assault and family court divorce hearing arrived rapidly with a cold, bleak gray sky. I sat quietly at the heavy, scratched wooden defendant table inside the stark, intimidating downtown courtroom. My cheap-assigned public defender was aggressively, nervously shuffling through a thin stack of useless legal papers, completely unprepared for the absolute bloodbath that was about to occur. The heavy wooden double doors at the absolute back of the courtroom suddenly swung wide open. Julian and Chloe walked slowly down the center aisle, looking like the absolute flawless picture of a wealthy, successful power couple. Julian was wearing a tailored charcoal suit that practically screamed corporate financial dominance. Chloe was wearing a conservative yet incredibly expensive designer dress, her face set in a perfect practiced mask of tragic victimhood. They walked arm in arm confidently, flanked by two high-priced aggressive defense attorneys carrying sleek, expensive leather briefcases. Julian looked over at me, sitting completely alone with my broken leg and my cheap public defender. He offered me a small, cruel, incredibly patronizing smile. Chloe completely refused to even look in my direction, utterly dismissing my humanity as she took her comfortable seat at the plaintiff table. They sat down, whispering confidently and happily to their lawyers, completely, utterly unaware that the solid ground beneath their feet had already permanently vanished. They believed they were casually walking into a simple routine hearing to permanently strip me of my physical freedom and my final teacher pension. They had absolutely no idea they were walking directly, blindly into a massive, inescapable federal ambush. The heavy mahogany doors of the county courthouse swung shut behind me, sealing me inside a room that felt more like an execution chamber than a hall of justice. The courtroom was packed. Every single wooden bench in the public gallery was filled with people I used to call my friends. Sarah had clearly mobilized the entire local church congregation. They sat together in tight rows, murmuring in hushed, judgmental voices and glaring at me with absolute open disgust. I hobbled down the center aisle on my cheap wooden crutches, the heavy plaster cast dragging against the polished linoleum floor. Every step sent a sharp, exhausting ache through my healing tibia, but I kept my back perfectly straight. I took my seat at the defense table. Next to me sat an overworked public defender who looked like he had not slept in 3 days. He was frantically shuffling through a thin stack of printed emails and police reports, sweating profusely under the harsh fluorescent lights. He leaned over and whispered that the prosecution had a completely ironclad case. He begged me to just sign Chloe's settlement offer, surrender my teacher pension, and take a plea deal for a reduced jail sentence. I completely ignored him. I sat down, rested my crutches against the table, and folded my hands. I knew exactly what was about to happen. The bailiff announced the arrival of the presiding judge. Judge Miller was a stern, uncompromising man in his late 50s, known for handing down maximum sentences in domestic violence cases. He took his seat at the high bench, adjusted his glasses, and looked down at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered disdain. Because my criminal charges and the emergency asset division of my divorce were fundamentally tied to the exact same incident, the court had agreed to a consolidated evidentiary hearing. This was the moment Julian and Chloe were going to use to permanently obliterate my life. The prosecution called their first witness. Sarah stood up from the front row, smoothing her conservative skirt, and walked confidently to the witness stand. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the whole truth. She looked out at the supportive faces of her church friends in the gallery and then turned her cold eyes toward the judge. Sarah delivered a flawless, meticulously rehearsed performance. She testified that she had been deeply worried about her sister for years. She claimed I was a deeply insecure man who constantly resented my wife for her massive success in the luxury real estate market. She told the judge completely fabricated stories about me drinking heavily alone in our garage, muttering angry threats under my breath. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a jealous, failing husband who could not handle being the inferior provider. My public defender stood up to cross-examine her, but his questions were weak and entirely ineffective. He asked if Sarah had ever actually seen me strike Chloe before the night of the incident. Sarah immediately started crying. She gripped the edges of the witness stand and sobbed that Chloe was too terrified to ever show her the bruises. A collective gasp of horror rippled through the church members in the gallery. The judge furiously scribbled notes on his legal pad, his jaw set in rigid anger. Sarah stepped down from the stand looking like a brave, protective hero. She walked past my table and shot me a microscopic, venomous smirk that only I could see. Next, the plaintiff attorney called Chloe to the stand. My wife walked slowly toward the front of the courtroom, her head bowed in perfect tragic submission. She was not wearing her usual expensive designer clothes or her flashy diamond jewelry. She wore a simple faded gray dress and zero makeup. She looked incredibly fragile. She took her seat on the witness stand and began to weep before the first question was even officially asked. Chloe told the judge a story that belonged in a terrifying Hollywood movie. She said I had come home early that afternoon completely enraged and reeking of cheap alcohol. She claimed I cornered her in the master bedroom screaming that she was hiding money from me. She testified that I demanded she transfer her recent real estate commissions into my personal bank account so I could pay off massive secret gambling debts. When she bravely refused, she said I completely snapped. She described me throwing objects across the room and lunging at her with my fists raised. Then she masterfully transitioned to the financial aspect of her lawsuit. Her high-priced divorce attorney stood up and asked the judge to finalize the total seizure of my assets. Chloe looked directly at the judge, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. "Your Honor," Chloe cried, her voice trembling with absolute flawless conviction. "I am utterly terrified of this man. The physical trauma he inflicted on me has completely shattered my sense of safety. I cannot sleep. I cannot focus on my clients. I have had to take an indefinite leave of absence from my real estate firm because I suffer from crippling panic attacks every single time a door opens. I am respectfully asking the court to grant me his state teacher pension. It is the only financial security available to cover my extensive trauma therapy and my lost wages while I try to put the broken pieces of my life back together." The judge nodded sympathetically, offering Chloe a gentle, reassuring look. I watched the woman I had loved for 5 years effortlessly lie under oath to steal the meager retirement fund I had earned teaching middle school children. She was a spectacular predator. She stepped down from the stand, wiping her eyes with a white tissue, and returned to her seat. Finally, the prosecution called their star witness. They called Julian. Julian stood up from his chair in the front row, and the entire energy of the courtroom shifted. He was wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue suit that easily cost $5,000. His expensive leather shoes clicked with pure unearned authority against the hard floor. He walked to the witness stand not as a man involved in a violent crime, but as a wealthy corporate executive doing a brief charitable favor for the justice system. He swore on the Bible and sat down, crossing one leg casually over the other. Julian spoke with the smooth, commanding baritone of a man who managed billions of dollars. He looked directly at the judge, professional to professional, completely ignoring my existence. "Your Honor." Julian began, his tone serious and deeply respectful. "I was visiting the residence simply to drop off some urgent commercial real estate contracts for Chloe. We work closely together on massive corporate property acquisitions. I was only there for 10 minutes when Harrison burst through the front door. He was completely unhinged. I could immediately smell the alcohol radiating off his clothes from across the hallway. He was screaming wildly at his wife, demanding her commission money. I tried to de-escalate the situation. I tried to talk to him man to calm him down, but he simply charged at Chloe like a wild animal." Julian paused, letting the heavy silence fill the massive courtroom. He shook his head, feigning deep regret. "I had absolutely no choice, Your Honor." Julian continued, his voice filled with fabricated sorrow. I stepped directly into his path to shield Chloe from the physical blow. Harrison collided with me, lost his drunken footing, and tumbled backward down the steep staircase. I immediately called 911. I stayed by his side and tried to offer medical assistance, but he was incredibly combative and violently cursing at the police officers when they arrived. I am just profoundly grateful that I was there to stop him from doing something far worse to his wife. The church congregation in the gallery actually murmured in quiet, collective approval. They were looking at Julian like he was a literal guardian angel sent from heaven to protect one of their own. Julian's defense attorney stood up and addressed the bench. "Your Honor, based on the overwhelming, undeniable testimony provided today, we strongly request that the court immediately finalize the permanent restraining order. Furthermore, we ask the court to fully grant the plaintiff all requested financial assets, including the total surrender of the defendant's state pension. My client and her protector have suffered enough at the hands of this deeply unstable individual." Julian smiled, a warm, handsome smile that completely masked the $24 million federal embezzlement scheme he was actively running. He looked like the absolute pinnacle of American success. He stepped down from the witness stand and walked back to the plaintiff table. As he sat down next to Chloe, he subtly reached over and gently squeezed her hand. It was a picture-perfect display of quiet strength and solidarity. They had won. They had flawlessly executed their trap, and the entire legal system was eagerly eating out of the palms of their hands. The prosecution formally rested their case. Chloe's high-powered divorce attorney formally rested her case. The heavy, suffocating silence in the courtroom turned entirely toward me. Judge Miller adjusted his reading glasses and stared down at me from his high wooden bench. His expression was harder than concrete. He had clearly already made his absolute final decision. He was simply going through the mandatory legal motions before slamming his heavy wooden gavel down and ending my life. "Mr. Harrison," the judge said, his voice booming loudly over the microphone, "the court has heard the testimony. The evidence presented against you is extraordinarily severe. Your actions have caused profound documented trauma to your wife and your community. Does the defense have any witnesses to call before I issue my final ruling on the criminal charges and the permanent division of your financial assets?" My public defender aggressively tugged on my sleeve. His face was shining with nervous sweat. "Just tell him no, Harrison," he whispered frantically in my ear. "Tell him no and throw yourself on the mercy of the court. If you try to argue with them now, he is going to give you the maximum possible sentence. Just surrender the pension and take the plea deal right now." I ignored the sweating lawyer entirely. I reached down, grabbed the handles of my cheap wooden crutches, and pushed my broken body up from the heavy wooden chair. The plaster cast felt like an absolute anchor, but I stood completely straight. I looked past the judge, past the mocking faces of Julian and Chloe, and stared directly at the heavy double doors at the absolute back of the crowded courtroom. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice ringing clear and perfectly steady, echoing off the high mahogany walls. "The defense calls exactly one witness to the stand." Chloe rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh of annoyance. Julian leaned back in his comfortable leather chair, crossing his arms over his expensive custom suit. He actually chuckled under his breath, completely amused by my pathetic, useless defiance. The church members in the gallery began to whisper, angrily annoyed that I was prolonging their triumphant victory. "And who exactly is your witness, Mr. Harrison?" the judge asked, sounding profoundly irritated by the delay. Before I could even open my mouth to answer, the heavy brass handles of the courtroom double doors turned with a loud, sharp click. The massive oak doors swung wide open, pushing a sudden rush of cold air directly into the stagnant, stifling heat of the courtroom. Every single head in the packed public gallery turned around simultaneously to see who had just arrived. My father walked slowly and deliberately through the open doorway. Richard was wearing an immaculate dark gray suit that projected total, absolute, unyielding corporate power. He carried a massive, heavily stuffed leather briefcase in his right hand. The sheer gravitational force of his terrifying presence completely silenced the whispering crowd. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. Julian immediately sat up straight in his chair. A massive, bright smile of absolute relief and unearned victory spread across his handsome face. He genuinely thought my father was there to support him. Julian firmly believed that the ruthless financial titan had taken time out of his busy day to personally testify against his own disappointing son and put the final nail in my miserable coffin. Julian subtly adjusted his expensive tie and gave my father a respectful, eager nod of acknowledgement. My father walked slowly down the long center aisle. The heavy rhythmic thud of his expensive leather shoes echoed loudly against the linoleum floor. He walked directly past the packed public gallery, completely ignoring the stunned faces of the church congregation. He walked straight past the plaintiff table. He did not look at Chloe. He did not return Julian's eager, triumphant smile. He did not even blink in their direction. Julian's confident smile slowly faltered, freezing awkwardly on his face as my father continued walking right past him. My father reached the wooden gate separating the gallery from the legal tables. He pushed the gate open, stepped into the defense area, and walked directly over to my side of the room. He set his massive, heavy leather briefcase down onto my scratched wooden table with a loud, echoing slam that made my public defender physically jump in his seat. Then my father pulled out the chair directly next to mine and sat down right beside his son. The entire courtroom descended into a state of absolute, breathless, terrified confusion. Julian stared at us, his eyes darting frantically between my father's stoic face and my calm, unyielding expression. The smug, arrogant certainty that had radiated from Julian just 10 seconds ago suddenly began to fracture and dissolve. He did not know what was happening, but the cold, terrifying realization that he had completely lost control of the narrative was beginning to set in. The illusion of their victory was over. The absolute destruction of their hollow empire had officially begun. The heavy silence in the courtroom was absolute. My father slowly stood up from the defense table. He buttoned his expensive dark gray suit jacket with a steady, terrifying precision. He did not look at me, but I could feel the massive weight of the decision he was about to make. He was about to willingly step into a fire that would burn his entire legacy to ashes. He walked toward the witness stand. The rhythmic sound of his leather shoes hitting the polished floor echoed like a ticking clock in the massive room. Chloe sat frozen at the plaintiff table. Her perfectly practiced mask of tragic victimhood was beginning to slip. She looked at Julian with wide, terrified eyes. Julian tried to maintain his arrogant posture, but I could see the tiny muscle in his jaw twitching violently. He still believed he had the upper hand. He still believed my father would never publicly betray the wealth management firm. He thought my father was simply playing some complex psychological game. He had absolutely no idea that his entire wealthy existence was about to be completely obliterated. My father stepped into the wooden witness box. He raised his right hand, placed his left hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the whole truth. He sat down and adjusted the microphone. He looked directly at Chloe's high-priced divorce attorney. The attorney looked completely bewildered. She had built her entire aggressive legal strategy on the assumption that my father hated me and supported his brilliant corporate protege. She decided to blindly stick to her original script. She confidently walked to the center of the room, flashing a warm, professional smile at my father. "Mr. Richard." she began, her voice echoing loudly over the sound system. You are the founder and chief executive officer of one of the most prestigious wealth management firms in the state. Is that correct? That is correct. My father answered, his voice deep and perfectly level. And the man sitting at the plaintiff table, Julian, is your managing partner. The attorney continued, gesturing smoothly toward Julian. You have worked closely with him for years. You have trusted him with billion-dollar portfolios. Would you say, based on your extensive professional relationship, that Julian is a man of exceptional moral character and unyielding integrity? Julian sat up slightly straighter in his chair. He offered my father a tight, respectful nod. He was waiting for the ultimate validation. He was waiting for the titan of industry to officially crown him the victor in front of the entire county justice system. My father did not answer immediately. He slowly reached down and picked up the massive, heavy leather briefcase he had carried into the courtroom. He placed it directly onto the wooden ledge of the witness stand. The loud, heavy thud made the attorney physically flinch. My father unlocked the brass latches with 2 sharp clicks. He opened the briefcase and pulled out a remarkably thick, heavy stack of printed financial ledgers. He placed them neatly next to the microphone. Julian is a predator, my father said. The words cut through the silent courtroom like a razor blade. The attorney froze, her confident smile instantly vanishing. Julian dropped his arrogant posture. His face went entirely pale. The church members sitting in the public gallery began to whisper frantically among themselves. Objection, the attorney stammered, waving her hands nervously. Your Honor, the witness is being hostile. Overruled, Judge Miller said, leaning forward in his high leather chair. His stern eyes were completely locked onto my father. The judge sensed exactly what I knew. This was not a standard family court dispute anymore. You may continue your testimony, sir, the judge instructed. My father picked up the top folder from the heavy stack of documents. He looked directly at Julian and then shifted his cold gray eyes to my terrified wife. Julian did not break my son's leg in an act of self-defense. My father spoke clearly and firmly into the microphone. His voice carried a terrifying, uncompromising authority. He broke my son's leg because my son unknowingly walked in on him celebrating the systematic theft of $24 million in federal pension funds. Funds that Julian personally embezzled from the most vulnerable elderly clients at my firm. A massive collective gasp erupted from the public gallery. Sarah, who was sitting in the front row, physically covered her mouth in absolute shock. The entire courtroom descended into a state of sudden blinding chaos. That is an absolute lie, Julian screamed. He jumped up from his chair, knocking it backward onto the hard floor. He is senile. He does not know what he is talking about. Your Honor, this is a completely fabricated attack on my professional reputation. Order in my court, Judge Miller bellowed, slamming his heavy wooden gavel down repeatedly. Mr. Julian, you will remain silent and take your seat immediately, or I will have the bailiffs drag you out of this room in chains. Julian slowly sank back into his chair, his chest heaving, his hands trembling violently. Chloe was gripping the edge of the plaintiff table so hard her knuckles were completely white. Her face was the color of dirty ash. She realized the trap had officially sprung. My father did not even blink at the interruption. He continued his testimony with the cold precision of a surgeon. The stolen pension money did not just vanish, Your Honor, my father stated, pulling a second folder from his briefcase. Julian needed to wash the money clean. He needed a domestic ghost account to launder $24 million completely outside the jurisdiction of the Securities and Exchange Commission. He utilized a corporate shell company registered as C&J Holdings. Chloe let out a sharp, terrified sob. She covered her face with her trembling hands. C&J Holdings is a limited liability company completely controlled by the plaintiff. Chloe, my father continued, pointing a steady, accusing finger directly at my wife. She used her specialized commercial real estate licenses to move the stolen cash through unregulated escrow accounts. She aggressively purchased luxury residential mansions and high-end commercial properties across the state to legitimize the stolen money. They turned $24 million of innocent people's retirement savings into dirty real estate. Objection! Chloe's attorney shouted frantically. Her voice was completely desperate. She was realizing her own wealthy client had paid her retainer using stolen federal funds. This is entirely hearsay. There is absolutely no proof of these wild accusations. My father reached into the thick stack of papers and pulled out a small black digital audio flash drive. He held it up for the entire courtroom to see. This drive contains a fully verified, securely encrypted audio recording. My father declared, his voice completely silencing the panicked attorney. It was recorded exactly 3 days ago at a private succession gala. On this recording, Julian explicitly proudly details the entire money laundering structure. He specifically names Chloe as his active willing co-conspirator. He explicitly admits to assaulting my son and intentionally framing him for domestic violence to completely discredit him as a potential witness. The audio is crystal clear. Julian looked like he was suffocating. He pulled desperately at the tight collar of his $5,000 suit. His arrogant, perfect facade had totally shattered. He was staring at the small black flash drive with a look of pure, unfiltered terror. He knew his entire wealthy existence was completely over. Judge Miller extended his hand downward toward the witness stand. The bailiff quickly rushed over, grabbed the thick stack of financial ledgers, the bank transfer receipts, and the digital flash drive, and handed them directly up to the judge. The judge put on his reading glasses and began flipping rapidly through the documents. The silence in the room was agonizing. The only sound was the sharp, crisp turning of thick paper as the judge absorbed the absolute staggering magnitude of the corporate fraud. "These transfer codes clearly trace back to your primary corporate liquidity accounts," the judge said, looking up at my father with a deep, heavy expression. "Sir, do you fully comprehend the severe legal ramifications of what you are submitting to this court today? If these ledgers are accurate, you are implicating your own central corporate accounts in a massive federal money laundering syndicate." I knew exactly what the judge meant. I had heard my father explain the brutal American financial system in the freezing diner. Exposing Julian meant exposing the entire firm to federal seizure. My father looked at the judge. His posture remained perfectly rigid, but I saw a profound, deep sadness wash over his weathered face. He looked out over the courtroom, and then he looked directly at me. He looked at the heavy plaster cast on my leg and the cheap wooden crutches resting against my table. He offered me a very small, very quiet smile of genuine respect. "I completely understand, Your Honor," my father said, turning his face back to the microphone. "By formally submitting this evidence, I fully acknowledge my profound failure as a chief executive officer. I failed to protect my clients. I trusted a corporate predator because he made me wealthy, and I relentlessly punished my own son because he chose to be an honest man. I am entirely responsible for the toxic culture that allowed this massive crime to occur." My father took a deep breath, bracing himself for the total loss of everything he had ever built. "I am officially permanently stepping down from my company," my father announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "I am turning my entire wealth management firm completely over to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In fact, they are currently raiding our corporate headquarters in the financial district as we speak. I surrendered the building keys to the federal agents exactly 1 hour ago." The absolute sheer magnitude of my father's sacrifice struck the courtroom like a massive physical shockwave. Julian's eyes widened in sheer blinding panic. He aggressively shoved his hand into his tailored suit pocket and pulled out his expensive smartphone. The device was buzzing frantically, violently vibrating against the wooden table. Julian stared at the bright digital screen. I could practically read the terrifying text messages reflecting in his completely terrified eyes. It was his corporate secretary. She was desperately screaming through the text messages that heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets had just stormed the executive lobby. They were kicking down the glass office doors, seizing the corporate servers, and carrying endless boxes of financial evidence out to armored black vans. The massive, untouchable, hollow empire was actively burning to the ground. Julian dropped the expensive phone. It hit the floor, and the glass screen shattered into a dozen jagged pieces. He looked frantically at the emergency exit doors at the side of the courtroom. He was actively calculating whether he could physically run. He was a wealthy corporate executive who suddenly realized he was going to spend the absolute best years of his life rotting in a tiny concrete cell. Chloe let out a long, loud, agonizing wail. It was not the fake, practiced cry of a domestic abuse victim. It was the raw, desperate scream of a greedy, status-obsessed woman who suddenly watched her stolen mansions, her expensive designer clothes, and her entire wealthy future dissolve into thin air. She reached out and desperately grabbed her high-priced lawyer's arm, begging for help. The attorney physically pulled her arm away, looking at Chloe with absolute professional disgust. At that exact moment, the heavy double doors at the absolute back of the crowded courtroom forcefully swung open once again. Two tall, imposing men wearing dark formal suits and heavy tactical belts confidently walked straight down the center aisle. They carried official federal badges prominently clipped to their belts. They were agents from the United States Marshals Service. They walked past the utterly stunned church congregation, past the completely silent public gallery, and walked directly up to the plaintiff table. "Julian, you are completely surrounded," one of the federal agents stated, his deep voice carrying a terrifying, unquestionable authority. He pulled a thick folded document from his jacket pocket. "We hold active federal arrest warrants for you and Chloe. You are both being taken into immediate federal custody for massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, money laundering, and severe felony perjury." Julian tried to stand up, but his legs completely failed him. He collapsed back into his chair. His perfectly styled hair, now a messy, unraveled disaster. He looked at my father with a pathetic, pleading expression, desperately hoping the old corporate shark would magically save him one last time. But my father simply sat on the witness stand, completely silent, watching the absolute total destruction of the man who had tried to steal his legacy. The federal agents stepped directly behind Julian and Chloe. The sharp, distinct metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly through the silent, terrified courtroom, entirely replacing the sound of Julian's shattered arrogance. The trap had perfectly, completely snapped shut. The long, brutal nightmare was over, and the absolute terrifying reality of justice had finally arrived. The heavy metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. It was the absolute final sound of Julian losing everything. The two federal agents from the United States Marshals Service did not care about his $5,000 custom suit. They did not care about his arrogant attitude or the fact that he managed billion-dollar portfolios. One of the agents firmly grabbed Julian by the bicep and violently yanked him upward. Julian stumbled, completely losing his balance. His expensive tailored jacket bunched up around his shoulders, suddenly making him look incredibly small and entirely pathetic. He tried to speak. He tried to use his smooth corporate voice to negotiate his way out of the arrest, but only a weak, pathetic stammer came out of his mouth. The illusion of his absolute power was gone. He was no longer a wealthy corporate titan. He was just a terrified criminal caught in a massive federal trap. Chloe let out a sound I had never heard before. It was not the fake, practiced crying she had used on the witness stand just 20 minutes earlier. It was a raw, ugly, visceral scream of pure panic. She dropped to her knees on the hard linoleum floor of the courtroom, her expensive designer dress twisted awkwardly around her legs. She looked wildly around the room, her chest heaving as she hyperventilated. Her eyes darted frantically toward the public gallery, desperately searching for the one person who had enabled her lies all along. She looked for her older sister. "Sarah, help me!" Chloe screamed, her voice cracking with absolute terror. "Please tell them to stop. Do something, Sarah. Call the church. Call the lawyers. You have to help me." I watched Sarah standing in the front row of the gallery. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a pale ghost. She looked at the federal agents. She looked at my father sitting calmly at the defense table. And then she looked at the furious, judging faces of the local church community members sitting all around her. Sarah realized in that exact moment that her perfect religious reputation was completely incinerated. She realized that if she defended her sister, she would be instantly dragged down into the exact same federal money laundering conspiracy. Sarah did the only thing a true coward knows how to do. She slowly took one step backward, then another. She turned her back on her screaming sister, violently pushed open the heavy wooden courtroom doors, and practically ran out into the hallway, abandoning Chloe entirely to save herself. The federal agents did not give Chloe any time to process her sister walking away. A female agent grabbed Chloe firmly by the arms and hauled her up from the floor. The metallic snap of a second pair of handcuffs echoed sharply through the room. They began marching Julian and Chloe down the center aisle of the courtroom, leading them directly toward the exit. The church members in the gallery pulled their feet back completely, refusing to even look at the two criminals they had praised as heroes just an hour earlier. As they were forcefully dragged past the defense table, Chloe dug her expensive heels into the floor. She aggressively threw her entire body weight backward, forcing the federal agent to stop for a fraction of a second. Chloe turned her head and looked directly at me. Her immaculate makeup was completely ruined. Dark black mascara ran down her pale cheeks in messy streaks. Her eyes were wide and filled with a wild, desperate, begging light. "Harrison, please!" Chloe cried, her voice echoing loudly in the high-ceilinged room. "You know me. You know I would never do this on my own. I was manipulated. Julian forced me to sign those real estate documents. You have to tell them, Harrison. You are a good man. Please tell the judge I was just a victim. Do not let them take me to prison." I stood up from the defense table. I did not need to lean heavily on my wooden crutches anymore. The pure adrenaline flooding my veins gave me all the strength I needed to stand perfectly straight. I looked down at the woman I had once promised to spend the rest of my life with. I looked at the woman who had smirked at me while her lover shattered my leg in my own home. I looked at the woman who had actively tried to steal my tiny teacher pension and throw me in a cage. I did not feel any anger anymore. I did not feel any sadness. I simply felt nothing but cold, absolute clarity. I looked her dead in the eye and delivered the exact same brutal sentence she had whispered to me on the floor of our hallway. "Who do you think they will believe?" I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely merciless. Chloe gasped violently as the words struck her like a physical blow. The absolute devastating realization hit her all at once. She had built her entire malicious strategy on the premise that no one would ever believe a broke middle school teacher over a wealthy corporate executive. Now that exact same terrifying reality was completely reversed. The female federal agent grabbed Chloe by the shoulder and forcefully shoved her forward. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung shut behind them, abruptly cutting off her hysterical sobbing. The room was finally completely silent. The nightmare was officially over. 6 months later, the absolute reality of my father turning over his own empire fully settled into the public eye. The fallout was massive and completely unprecedented. The federal government officially dissolved the wealth management firm, permanently liquidating every single corporate asset to rightfully reimburse the elderly clients who had their federal pension funds stolen. The massive glass building in the financial district was completely emptied out. Julian did not even try to fight the charges in court. Faced with the undeniable audio recording and the meticulously highlighted financial ledgers I had organized in the freezing cabin, he took a desperate plea deal. He is currently serving a mandatory 15-year sentence in a maximum security federal prison. He lost his custom suits, his luxury imported cars, and every single ounce of his fabricated corporate power. He is just another number in a bright orange jumpsuit completely forgotten by the wealthy elite society he worshipped. Chloe suffered an equally brutal fate. The State Real Estate Commission permanently revoked her professional commercial licenses, preventing her from ever selling another property for the rest of her life. Because she had actively facilitated the massive money laundering operation through her private escrow accounts, the judge showed her absolutely no mercy. She was sentenced to 7 grueling years in a state correctional facility. The woman who once craved imported marble countertops and crystal chandeliers is now spending 14 hours a day working in the humid, suffocating prison laundry room. Her perfectly manicured hands are completely blistered and calloused from scrubbing industrial bleach into dirty prison uniforms. The empty, hollow life of luxury she destroyed me to attain had completely vanished, leaving her with nothing but concrete walls and the devastating memory of her own greed. As for me, the passage of 6 months brought a completely different kind of transformation. My shattered tibia finally healed. I no longer needed the cheap wooden crutches or the heavy plaster cast. I spent weeks doing rigorous physical therapy, slowly rebuilding the muscle and the strength in my right leg. Every single step I took without pain felt like a monumental, hard-earned victory. On a crisp, bright Saturday morning, I drove my modest, reliable truck up the familiar winding gravel road deep into the dense pine forest. The brutal freezing winter had finally surrendered to a warm, golden spring. I pulled into the muddy clearing and put the truck in park. The decaying off-the-grid hunting cabin, where I had spent 2 agonizing weeks fighting for my life, was completely unrecognizable. My father and I had spent the last few months working side by side to fully restore it. The sagging, rotting porch had been replaced with thick, sturdy oak planks. The broken windows were fixed, and a fresh coat of warm brown stain protected the strong wooden walls. A steady, comforting stream of white smoke drifted lazily from the rebuilt stone chimney. I walked up the sturdy wooden steps without a single limp. Sitting on a simple wooden rocking chair on the front porch was Richard. He was not wearing a $5,000 custom-tailored suit. He was not wearing a silk tie or expensive leather dress shoes. My father was wearing a faded flannel shirt and a pair of worn denim jeans. He held a simple ceramic mug of steaming black coffee in his hands. When he looked up and saw me walking toward him, a genuine warm smile spread across his deeply lined face. Without the massive crushing weight of his hollow corporate empire, he looked easily 10 years younger. The ruthless, terrifying financial titan who had prioritized portfolios over his own blood was completely gone. In his place was a quiet, peaceful man who had finally realized what actually mattered in this world. He stood up and handed me a second mug of hot coffee. We stood side by side on the sturdy porch, looking out over the quiet, beautiful forest. We did not need to say a single word about the money or the courtroom or the empire he had willingly burned to the ground to save me. The silence between us was no longer heavy with judgment or disappointment. It was filled with a profound, deeply earned mutual respect. Thanks to the completely clean personal trust fund my father had secretly established for me before the federal raid, I now possessed a level of absolute financial freedom I had never anticipated. I was no longer worried about paying my mortgage or surviving on a modest teaching salary. But instead of buying a flashy sports car or a massive empty mansion, I chose to use the money to simply live my life entirely on my own terms. I returned to the local middle school to teach 8th grade history, not because I had to, but because it was the only thing I genuinely deeply loved doing. I finally had the quiet, peaceful life I had always wanted, and more importantly, I finally had a father who truly respected the man I was. I took a slow, deep sip of the hot, black coffee and looked down at my healed leg. I thought about Julian and Chloe sitting in their cold, concrete prison cells. I thought about all the arrogant, greedy people in the world who believe that true power comes from the brand of your suit or the size of your bank account. People will do absolutely anything to build a hollow empire, forgetting that the only foundation that actually matters is the undeniable truth. They will lie, they will cheat, and they will completely destroy the people who love them just to maintain a fragile illusion of superiority. Julian and Chloe thought I was incredibly weak because I actively chose a simple, honest life. They looked at my modest house and my public school teacher salary, and they firmly believed I was a pathetic failure who could be easily crushed and swept aside. But they fundamentally completely misunderstood what true strength actually is. True strength is not loud. It is not arrogant. It does not need to show off or violently push other people down a staircase to prove its worth. True strength is the quiet, unyielding refusal to surrender when the entire world tells you that you are nothing. When the devastating storm finally came, their massive, beautiful mansions of glass instantly shattered into a million tiny pieces. But my foundation held. I survived the brutal, freezing darkness of that cabin, and I walked out into the light exactly as the man I was always meant to be. If you firmly believe that the honest truth always outlasts selfish greed, I want you to hit the like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment below and tell me about a specific time in your own life when someone completely underestimated your quiet strength and you proved them absolutely wrong. Your stories genuinely inspire me to keep going. And please make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story of absolute justice served incredibly cold. Thank you so much for listening, and remember that the longest, most difficult roads always lead to the strongest foundations.